Hello, my friends. I hope you're all doing well. Before we begin, I have a small favor to ask. Ranger Screams is going through a difficult time right now, and we truly need your support. Our goal is to reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments on this video. If everyone watching leaves a like and writes a comment, we can absolutely make it happen together. It would make a huge difference and help the channel more than you know. Thank you so much for your support. Now get comfortable, and let's begin. The moment I set eyes on Lake Wanana, I knew I had made a terrible mistake accepting this post. It wasn't the isolation that bothered me. After all, I'd specifically requested a remote assignment. After 3 years as a ranger at Mount Rainier National Park, dealing with endless tourist questions and parking violations, I was ready for something more authentic, something that would test me. But as my battered Ford Ranger crawled along the final stretch of unpaved road, the dense wall of ancient cedars suddenly broke to reveal the still, black waters of Lake Wanana stretching before me, and an inexplicable feeling of dread settled in my gut. Wanan was derived from a Salish word meaning shadow waters. According to the briefing packet I'd been given, the native tribes who once inhabited this region of the Powhatan Wilderness believed the lake was a sacred place, a threshold between worlds. They spoke of it with reverence and fear. Now I understood why. The ranger cabin sat on a small ridge overlooking the eastern shore. It was more substantial than I'd expected, a sturdy structure built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, with rough-hewn logs blackened by decades of Pacific Northwest rain. A small dock extended into the water, where an aluminum boat was secured, gently bobbing in the wind-driven ripples. As I pulled up to the cabin, Ranger Sullivan emerged from the doorway. He was a grizzled veteran of the Forest Service, weeks away from retirement after 30 years of service. His sunburned face creased into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes as he approached my truck. "So, you're the new blood," he said, extending a calloused hand as I stepped out. "Thought they'd send someone older." "I requested the assignment," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. 2 years at Olympic and 3 at Rainier. I wanted something quieter. Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Well, you got it. 50 miles to the nearest town. No cell service, just the radio for emergencies." He gestured toward the cabin. "Solar panels for basic power, propane for heat and cooking, water from the well out back. It's good. Comes from deep underground." I nodded, taking it all in. "How many visitors do you usually get?" Sullivan's laugh was short and harsh. "Not many. Occasional hikers in summer, hunters in the fall, though they're not supposed to be here. This isn't exactly a tourist destination." "That's fine by me." "Is it?" Sullivan studied me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You know, most rangers request transfers out of here after a season. Some don't even last that long." "Not most rangers," he snorted. "That's what they all say." He turned toward the cabin. "Come on. I'll show you around." The interior was simple but functional. A main room with a wood stove, small kitchen area, and a desk with maps and logbooks, a bedroom with a twin bed and dresser, and a small bathroom with a shower that, Sullivan warned, only provided hot water when the sun's been cooperating. A generator sat outside for emergency power, though fuel had to be brought in by truck. "Your main job is monitoring," Sullivan explained as he showed me the patrol routes on a topographical map spread across the desk. "Check the trails for debris, maintain the boundary markers, keep an eye out for fires. Standard stuff." "What about wildlife?" Sullivan hesitated. "We've got black bears, obviously. Mountain lions, the usual predators. Nothing you haven't dealt with before." Something in his tone made me probe further. "Anything unusual I should know about?" His weather-beaten face remained neutral, but I noticed his fingers tighten slightly on the edge of the map. "There have been incidents over the years." "What kind of incidents?" "Missing hikers, mostly. People who venture off trail and get lost. It happens in any wilderness area." "But," Sullivan sighed, rolling up the map with deliberate care. "But the ones who do turn up don't always make sense of what happened to them. They talk about being followed, watched. Strange sounds at night." I raised an eyebrow. "Bears can be pretty intimidating to inexperienced hikers. That's what the official reports say." He placed the map in a metal tube and secured it in a cabinet. "Just keep your wits about you, especially at night, and stay out of the northern basin." "The northern basin?" Sullivan pointed through the window to where the lake curved around a densely forested peninsula. "Beyond that point, it's restricted. Environmental study area." "What are they studying?" "Above my pay grade." He checked his watch. "I need to head out if I'm going to make it to Winthrop before dark. The radio procedure is in the manual. Check in with headquarters every morning at 0800 and again at 1700. Any questions?" I had dozens, but something told me Sullivan wasn't going to provide satisfying answers. I shook my head. "Good. He grabbed his duffel bag from beside the door. "One more thing. If you hear anything unusual at night, stay inside, no matter what it sounds like." With that cryptic warning, Sullivan departed, the sound of his truck fading into the distance until all I could hear was the whisper of wind through the cedars and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. I spent the remainder of the afternoon familiarizing myself with the cabin and its surroundings. The logbooks were meticulously maintained, documenting weather conditions, wildlife sightings, and the occasional visitor. Sullivan had been diligent, but I noticed gaps in the entries during the winter months. Sometimes weeks would pass without a single note. As darkness fell, I lit the wood stove and prepared a simple dinner from the supplies I'd brought. The cabin creaked and settled around me, the sounds amplified in the profound silence of the wilderness. Through the window, the moonlight cast a silver path across the lake's surface, illuminating wisps of fog that drifted like phantoms above the water. I was just about to turn in for the night when I heard it, a long, mournful cry echoing across the lake. It wasn't quite a howl, nor was it the scream of a mountain lion. It was something in between, with an almost human quality that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. Remembering Sullivan's warning, I extinguished the lantern and moved to the window. The moonlight revealed nothing unusual along the shoreline or in the surrounding forest. But as I watched, the fog on the lake seemed to thicken and coalesce, forming shapes that moved against the wind before dissolving back into formless mist. The cry came again, closer this time. Then silence, broken only by the irregular tempo of my heartbeat. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks, or perhaps a loon, though Sullivan hadn't mentioned loons in his wildlife inventory. I checked the locks on the doors and windows before climbing into bed, drawing the blankets tight around me despite the warmth from the wood stove. Sleep came eventually, but it was restless and plagued by dreams of dark waters and half-glimpsed shapes moving through the trees. In one particularly vivid nightmare, I found myself standing on the dock, staring into the depths of the lake. Something enormous moved beneath the surface, circling slowly before rising toward me. I tried to back away, but my feet were rooted to the weathered planks. Just as a vast, shadowy form was about to break the surface, I awoke with a gasp. Dawn was breaking, pale light filtering through the curtains. I lay still for a moment, listening. The cabin was quiet except for the occasional pop from the dying embers in the wood stove. I rose and moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain to survey the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the pinkish glow of the morning sky. Nothing seemed amiss, until I noticed the footprints on the shore. They started at the water's edge and led directly to the cabin, stopping just below my window. They were huge, at least 16 inches long, and deeply impressed in the wet soil. The stride length was enormous, suggesting whatever made them stood well over 7 feet tall. My first instinct was to dismiss them as a prank, Sullivan's parting gift perhaps, but as I studied them more closely through the window, I knew no human could have made these prints. The shape was all wrong, wider at the front with 5 distinct toe impressions, narrowing to a rounded heel. They resembled a human footprint only in the most general sense. I grabbed my camera and hurried outside, careful to avoid disturbing the tracks. The morning air was crisp and heavy with moisture, the scent of cedar and pine mingling with the earthy aroma of the lake. I photographed the prints from multiple angles, placing my own boot next to one for scale. The difference was disturbing. Following the tracks backward, I found where they emerged from the water. Following them forward, they stopped abruptly beneath my window, as if whatever made them had stood there, watching me sleep. There were no tracks leading away. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. I wasn't alone out here. Something had visited in the night, something large enough to leave prints that dwarfed my own. I knew what the locals would call it, what any cryptozoology enthusiast would immediately suggest. But I was a ranger, trained in wildlife biology. I didn't believe in monsters or myths, at least, I didn't before Lake Wanana. The radio crackled to life precisely at 0800, Wanana Station. "This is Northwest Dispatch. Morning check-in. Over." I grabbed the handset, hesitating. Should I report the footprints? My scientific training battled with what I'd seen with my own eyes. "Northwest Dispatch. This is Wanana Station. All normal here." I finally responded. "Weather clear, temperature approximately 45 degrees. No incidents to report." "Copy that, Wanana. Sullivan make it out okay?" "Yes, he departed yesterday evening." "Welcome to Solitude, Ranger. Remember, morning and evening check-ins are mandatory. Missed 2 in a row, and we send a helicopter. Anything else to report?" My eyes drifted to the window, where I could still see the massive footprints in the soil. "No, nothing else." "Copy that. Northwest Dispatch out." I replaced the handset and stood there for a long moment, questioning my decision. The rational part of my brain insisted there must be a logical explanation for the tracks, perhaps some unknown species of bear walking on its hind legs, or even an elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew neither explanation fit what I'd seen. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my pack, sidearm, and camera, determined to investigate. The patrol routes Sullivan had shown me covered most of the southern portion of the lake and the surrounding forest, but deliberately avoided the northern basin, the restricted area he'd mentioned. The tracks led in that direction. I followed the shoreline, moving cautiously and stopping frequently to listen. The forest was alive with normal sounds, the chatter of squirrels, the distant drumming of woodpeckers, the rustle of wind through the canopy. Yet there was an underlying tension, a sense of being observed that I couldn't shake. About a mile from the cabin, I found another set of the massive prints, these emerging from the forest and leading into the water. They were fresher than the ones near the cabin, the edges still crisp. Whatever made them had entered the lake not long ago. I photographed these as well, then scanned the opposite shore with my binoculars. Nothing moved along the tree line, but as I panned across the peninsula that separated the main lake from the northern basin, I caught a glimpse of something unusual, a flash of metal among the trees. Adjusting the focus, I could make out what appeared to be some sort of structure, partially concealed by the dense vegetation. It wasn't on any of Sullivan's maps. My curiosity overrode my caution. I returned to the cabin, retrieved the aluminum boat, and set out across the lake. The water was deeper than I expected, the surface like black glass reflecting the encircling mountains. Occasionally, ripples would form with no apparent cause, as if something large was moving deep below. As I approached the peninsula, the sense of being watched intensified. The forest here was older, the trees massive and draped with hanging moss that stirred in the absence of wind. I secured the boat to a fallen log and proceeded on foot, moving as quietly as possible. The structure was approximately half a mile inland, a small, windowless building constructed of concrete and metal, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. A heavy padlock secured the gate, and signs warned, "Government property, no unauthorized access, violators will be prosecuted." There were no identifying markings to indicate which government agency operated the facility, no vehicles, and no signs of recent human activity. The whole setup reminded me of the remote monitoring stations used by the USGS to track seismic activity, except those didn't typically require security fencing or look like miniature bunkers. I circled the perimeter, keeping a safe distance. On the far side, I discovered a clearing where the forest had been cut back to create a small helicopter landing pad. The painted markings faded but still visible. Whatever this place was, it was accessed primarily by air. As I prepared to leave, something caught my eye. A motion-activated camera mounted on one of the fence posts, its lens pointed directly at me. A red light blinked steadily, indicating it was recording. So much for remaining unnoticed. I retreated into the forest, intending to return to my boat. But as I navigated through the dense underbrush, I realized I'd lost my bearings. The canopy was so thick here that I couldn't see the sun to orient myself. I reached for my compass only to find it spinning erratically, unable to fix on magnetic north. For the first time, genuine alarm took hold. I was an experienced ranger, well-trained in wilderness navigation. Getting lost like this shouldn't happen. I forced myself to remain calm, listening for the sound of the lake. Water carries sound, and I hadn't gone far enough to lose audio contact with the lapping waves. But the forest was unnaturally silent. No birds called, no squirrels chattered. Even the insects had fallen quiet. The only sound was my own breathing and the soft crunch of pine needles beneath my boots. Then I heard it, a heavy footfall behind me, followed by another. Something large was moving through the forest, paralleling my path. I turned slowly, hand dropping to my sidearm. The undergrowth parted about 50 yards away, and for a brief moment I saw it. A massive, dark figure standing upright among the trees. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in what appeared to be dark, matted fur. Its proportions were vaguely human, but wrong somehow. The arms too long, the shoulders too broad. Before I could fully process what I was seeing, it stepped backward into the deeper shadows and was gone. My heart hammered against my ribs. Fight or flight took over, and I crashed through the forest in what I hoped was the direction of the lake. Branches slashed at my face. Roots threatened to trip me, but pure adrenaline kept me moving. I burst through the tree line at the shore, but in a different location from where I'd left my boat. Scanning frantically in both directions, I spotted it about a quarter-mile to the south. I sprinted along the rocky beach, expecting at any moment to feel powerful hands close around me from behind. When I reached the boat, I shoved it into the water and scrambled aboard, not stopping to remove my boots or roll up my pants. The outboard motor coughed twice before catching, and I angled the boat toward the distant cabin, pushing the small engine to its limits. Halfway across, I cut the motor and drifted, watching the peninsula through my binoculars. The shoreline remained empty. If whatever I'd seen had pursued me, it remained hidden among the trees. But as I prepared to restart the engine, something large broke the surface of the water about 100 yards away. It was gone before I could focus my binoculars, just a dark shape that rolled smoothly back beneath the surface, leaving concentric ripples expanding outward. I revved the engine to full throttle, no longer caring about noise or appearances. The boat skimmed across the water, bouncing painfully over its own wake. When I finally reached the cabin's dock, I secured the boat with trembling hands and retreated inside, locking the door behind me. At the desk, I opened the logbook, intending to document my experience. But as the pen hovered over the blank page, I hesitated. What exactly had I seen? A bear? A moose? My rational mind grasped for explanations, but none fit the figure I'd glimpsed in the forest. And what about the structure on the peninsula? Its presence raised more questions than answers. Was it monitoring the lake, the surrounding forest, or something else entirely? In the end, I made a simple entry. Investigated northern peninsula. Discovered restricted federal installation. Wildlife abundant but cautious. Not a lie, but far from the complete truth. As evening approached, I radioed in for my mandatory check-in, again reporting that all was normal. After signing off, I stood at the window watching the light fade from the sky, casting the lake into deepening shadow. In the gathering darkness, I could almost convince myself that the day's events had been a product of isolation and an overactive imagination. Almost. I secured the cabin for the night, checking and rechecking the locks. I cleaned my sidearm and left it on the bedside table within easy reach. Outside, an owl called. Its mournful hooting carried on the night breeze. Ordinary forest sounds, but as I settled into bed, the same cry I'd heard the previous night echoed across the lake. That strange, not quite human howl that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was answered by another, more distant cry from somewhere deep in the forest. They weren't hunting calls or territorial warnings. They sounded almost like communication. Sleep eluded me for hours, my mind replaying the glimpse of that tall, dark figure among the trees. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shadowy forms moving beneath the black waters of Lake Wenana, rising toward the surface with purpose. I awoke to the sound of something heavy moving around the exterior of the cabin. Wood creaked as weight shifted against the walls. Through the window, I could see it was still dark, the forest illuminated only by the faint light of a waning moon. The scratching came next. Slow, deliberate drags along the outer logs, as if something with long claws was testing the structure's integrity. It moved methodically around the perimeter, pausing occasionally as if listening. I lay frozen in bed, the blankets pulled to my chin, hardly daring to breathe. My hand crept toward the sidearm on the bedside table, fingers closing around the grip. When the scratching reached the window, I caught a glimpse of movement, a massive silhouette briefly visible against the night sky. Then came a soft, rhythmic tapping on the glass, almost like knuckles rapping gently for attention. I remained motionless, gun trained on the window, heart pounding so loudly I was certain whatever was outside could hear it. The tapping stopped. Long moments passed in silence. Then, from just outside the wall nearest my head came a sound that sent ice through my veins, a low, rumbling vocalization that was almost, but not quite, words. It rose and fell in a pattern that suggested language, but unlike any I'd ever heard, it was trying to speak. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. Morning revealed new tracks around the cabin, deeper than before. Whatever had circled the structure in the night was even larger than I'd initially thought. The scratches on the outer walls were clearly visible, long, parallel grooves in the weathered wood, some as high as 9 feet above the ground. Most disturbing were the markings on a large cedar tree at the edge of the clearing. The bark had been stripped away in a deliberate pattern, creating what appeared to be a crude symbol, a vertical line bisected by 3 horizontal slashes. It hadn't been there the day before. I spent the morning securing the cabin further, checking for weak points and ensuring all entrances were reinforced. As I worked, I tried to process what was happening. My scientific training warred with what I was experiencing. Logic insisted there must be a rational explanation. Perhaps a rogue bear with unusual behaviors, or even someone in a costume attempting to frighten me away. But neither explanation accounted for the intelligence behind the scratching pattern, the deliberate creation of symbols, or the vocalizations that seemed designed to communicate. At 0800, I made my scheduled radio check-in, again reporting all normal. I considered mentioning the tracks and scratches, but held back. Without context, it would sound like I was either lying or losing my mind. I needed more concrete evidence. After the call, I reviewed the photographs I'd taken of the footprints. They remained unexplainable by conventional wildlife biology. The shape, size, and stride length matched no known species in the Pacific Northwest. Yet they were real. I hadn't imagined them. My thoughts turned to the restricted installation on the peninsula. Was there a connection? The facility's presence in such a remote location couldn't be coincidental. It had to be monitoring something, and given its position overlooking the northern basin, that something was likely in or around the lake. I needed more information, but my unplanned visit had almost certainly been recorded by the security camera. Someone knew I'd been there. Would they come to investigate, or were they already watching me? The radio crackled unexpectedly, making me jump. One of a station. This is Northwest Dispatch. Over. Strange. They never called outside scheduled check-ins unless there was an emergency. I grabbed the handset. Northwest Dispatch. This is One on a station. Over. We're patching through a call from Regional Command. Stand by. There was a burst of static. Then a new voice. Deeper. More authoritative. One of our station. This is Regional Director Blackwood. We've received reports of unauthorized activity in a restricted area under your jurisdiction. Can you confirm? My mouth went dry. Sir, I conducted a standard patrol of the area yesterday and may have inadvertently crossed into a marked restricted zone. I was establishing my boundaries. That area is clearly marked on your maps as off-limits, Ranger. It's a sensitive research installation. May I ask what kind of research is being conducted there? There was a pause. That information is classified. However, I can tell you it's a long-term environmental monitoring project. Has there been any unusual activity in your area recently? Any wildlife disturbances? The scratches on the cabin walls flashed in my mind. The footprints. The dark shape in the forest. Nothing significant to report, sir. Another pause. Longer this time. I see. A research team will be arriving by helicopter tomorrow to inspect the installation. They'll need access to your cabin as a base of operations. Please make the necessary preparations. Understood, sir. One more thing, Ranger. For your own safety, maintain your distance from the northern basin. If you observe any unusual wildlife, do not approach. Report it immediately through secure channels. Is that clear? Crystal clear, sir. Regional Command out. The radio fell silent, leaving me with more questions than answers. They were coming tomorrow, not just to check the installation, but to check on me. And what did Blackwood mean by unusual wildlife? He knew something. They were monitoring something specific. The rest of the day passed in tense preparation. I cleaned the cabin, organized my notes, and secured the photographs I'd taken. If the research team was looking for evidence that I'd seen something, they wouldn't find it easily. By evening, low clouds had rolled in, bringing a light drizzle that shrouded the lake in mist. The falling darkness seemed more oppressive than usual, the shadows deeper and more substantial. I completed my evening check-in, then heated a can of stew on the propane stove, my appetite diminished by the day's events. As I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. The cabin's windows, now revealing only my own reflection against the night, seemed to conceal watching eyes beyond the glass. Occasionally the mist would shift, forming shapes that dissolved when I tried to focus on them. I was nearly finished with my meal when the power went out. The solar system should have provided enough stored energy to last through the night, even without direct sunlight during the day. I lit a kerosene lantern and checked the electrical panel. No obvious issues there. Moving to the window, I peered out at the small shed that housed the batteries and inverter. The security light that normally illuminated it was dark, but in the glow from my lantern, I could see the shed door standing open, swinging gently in the breeze. I definitely hadn't left it that way. My sidearm felt reassuring against my hip as I pulled on a rain jacket and stepped onto the porch. Lantern held high. The rain had intensified, driven by gusts of wind that sent sheets of water across the clearing. Visibility was poor, the lantern's glow creating a small bubble of light surrounded by impenetrable darkness. I moved cautiously toward the shed, scanning the tree line for movement. Nothing seemed amiss until I reached the small structure and looked inside. The battery connections had been deliberately severed, the heavy cables pulled apart with significant force. No animal could have done this. It was too precise, too targeted. Someone, or something, had intentionally cut power to the cabin. A branch snapped in the forest, the sound carrying clearly despite the rain. I spun toward it, hand dropping to my weapon. "Hello," I called, immediately regretting making my position known. "This is a federal ranger station. Identify yourself." No response came from the darkness. But as I swept the lantern in a slow arc, the light briefly caught a pair of eyes reflecting at the forest's edge. Large, widely spaced, and positioned at a height that could only belong to something standing well over 7 feet tall. They blinked once, then vanished. I backed toward the cabin, keeping the lantern extended to maximize my field of vision. The rain plastered my hair to my scalp, running in rivulets down my face and neck. Each step seemed to take an eternity, the distance to the safety of the cabin stretching impossibly. When my foot hit the bottom porch step, I heard it, that same vocalization from the previous night, but louder now, more insistent. It came from directly behind me. I whirled. drawing my weapon in the same motion. The lantern swung wildly, casting chaotic shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source. For a brief, terrifying moment, the illumination fell on a massive figure standing at the edge of the clearing, broad-shouldered, covered in dark fur matted by the rain, its face concealed by shadow but its eyes reflecting the lantern's glow with an almost human intelligence. Then it was gone, melting into the darkness with surprising speed for something so large. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I bolted into the cabin, slammed the door, and threw both locks. My hands shook so badly I could barely manage the simple task. Without power, the cabin's interior was cold and unwelcoming. The shadows beyond my lantern's reach deep and alive with imagined movement. I placed the light on the table and retrieved my satellite phone from my pack, the emergency device I'd been instructed to use only in genuine crises. This qualified. I dialed the emergency contact number, but before it could connect, the signal died. No service. Even the satellite connection, which should have functioned regardless of my remote location, was somehow blocked. Outside, something heavy circled the cabin. I could hear its footsteps in the wet soil, the occasional brush of what might have been a hand against the outer walls. It was testing the structure, looking for weaknesses. I retreated to the bedroom, weapon ready, back against the wall furthest from the windows. The rain intensified, hammering on the roof like impatient fingers. Thunder rumbled in the distance, momentarily drowning out the sounds of whatever stalked the perimeter. But when the thunder faded, a new sound emerged, a rhythmic tapping on the bedroom window, too deliberate to be caused by the storm. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. I raised my gun, aiming at the window. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking with strain. "Leave me alone." The tapping stopped abruptly. Silence stretched, broken only by the rain and my own ragged breathing. Then, softly at first but growing steadily louder, came a sound that froze my blood, a series of vocalizations that unmistakably mimicked my own words. "Go. Away. Leave. Alone." The voice was deep, guttural, the words mangled but recognizable. It wasn't just mimicry. There was intent behind it, a crude attempt at communication. "What are you?" I whispered, though I knew the question was absurd. Whatever was outside couldn't possibly answer in a way I'd understand, but it tried. "Wanamna," came the growled response. Then again, more insistently, "Wanamna," the name of the lake, or perhaps what it really meant, Shadow Waters. The threshold between worlds. A massive fist hammered against the window frame, rattling the glass in its mounting. The creature, because I could no longer pretend it was anything else, was growing impatient. I backed further away, pressing myself into the corner, weapon trained on the window. If the glass broke, if it came through, but it didn't. The pounding stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Footsteps retreated, heavy splashes indicating movement toward the lake. Then silence, save for the relentless percussion of the rain. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I maintained my vigil in the corner, jumping at every creak of the cabin's timbers, every gust of wind that moaned through the eaves. The lantern burned steadily, creating a small haven of light in the darkness, but its fuel wouldn't last forever. Dawn arrived with aching slowness, the gray light of morning gradually revealing an empty clearing around the cabin. No massive figure lurked at the tree line, no eyes watched from the shadows, but the evidence of the night's visitor remained. New footprints in the mud, deeper than before, and something else, a crude arrangement of broken branches on the porch, forming the same symbol that had been carved into the cedar tree. A message, a warning, or an invitation. The helicopter arrived precisely at noon, its rhythmic thump, thump, thump growing steadily louder until it appeared over the tree line, a sleek black shape against the overcast sky. It circled the cabin once before settling onto the small clearing near the dock, its rotors whipping the lake into frothy wavelets. I stood on the porch, watching as 4 figures disembarked. 3 men and a woman, all dressed in identical dark rain gear, with no identifying insignia. They carried equipment cases and duffel bags, moving with the coordinated efficiency of a team accustomed to working together. The apparent leader approached while the others unloaded gear. He was tall and lean, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that revealed nothing. "Ranger," he said by way of greeting, extending a hand. "Dr. Lawrence, Environmental Research Division." "Which department?" I asked, accepting the handshake. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Just the department will do. These are my colleagues, Dr. Chen, Mr. Reyes, and Miss Bennett." The others nodded in acknowledgement but remained focused on their tasks. None appeared particularly friendly. "You've lost power," Lawrence observed, glancing at the dark windows of the cabin. "Equipment failure during the storm last night," I replied, careful to keep my tone neutral. "The battery connections were damaged. We'll have our technician look at it." He studied me with Clinical detachment. Rough night? I realized how I must appear. Unshaven, clothing rumpled, dark circles under my eyes from lack of sleep. The storm kept me up, I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. Lawrence nodded, not quite believing me. We'll need to use your cabin as a base of operations for the next few days. Regional Director Blackwood explained this? He did. May I ask exactly what you're researching? Environmental anomalies, Lawrence replied vaguely. Long-term ecological surveillance. Nothing that should interfere with your duties. Before I could press further, the woman, Bennett, approached, carrying what looked like a specialized scanner. Site secure, Doctor, she reported. No unauthorized signals or devices detected. Lawrence nodded. Excellent. Ranger, perhaps you could show us inside. The team efficiently transformed my simple cabin into an operations center. Electronic equipment appeared from their cases, filling the main room with screens, keyboards, and devices I couldn't identify. Reyes, the youngest member of the group, restored power within minutes, though he seemed puzzled by the damage to the battery connections. This wasn't equipment failure, he told Lawrence quietly, though I overheard from the kitchen where I was preparing coffee. The cables were forcibly separated. Something strong did this. Lawrence's eyes flicked toward me momentarily. Document it and repair the damage. Full security protocol. Chen, a slight man with wire-rimmed glasses, established a satellite uplink that seemed far more powerful than standard communications gear. Within an hour, they had created a self-contained command post, complete with monitoring equipment pointed toward the northern basin. I tried to make myself useful, answering questions about the local terrain and weather patterns, all while observing their operation. They were clearly not standard environmental researchers. Their equipment, their demeanor, the practiced way they secured the perimeter. These were the hallmarks of a military or intelligence operation. As evening approached, Lawrence and Bennett prepared to depart for the installation on the peninsula, leaving Chen and Reyes to monitor the equipment. I offered to guide them, mentioning my previous visit to the site. That won't be necessary, Lawrence replied, checking a compact GPS unit. We know the way. The terrain can be disorienting, I persisted. Compasses don't work reliably near the northern basin. This caught Lawrence's attention. You've noticed magnetic anomalies? Among other things. His eyes narrowed. What exactly have you observed since arriving, Ranger? I hesitated, weighing my options. These people knew more than they were revealing. If I wanted answers, I needed to show some of my cards. Unusual tracks around the cabin, I said carefully. Large, bipedal, not consistent with known wildlife. And last night, something deliberately disabled the power and attempted to communicate. Bennett and Lawrence exchanged glances. Communicate how? Bennett asked, her professional detachment slipping slightly. Vocalization, mimicry of human speech, and symbols, arrangements of branches in specific patterns. Lawrence's expression hardened. You should have reported this immediately through proper channels. To whom? Regional Director Blackwood, who didn't see fit to warn me what I was dealing with. Or perhaps to Ranger Sullivan, who left me with cryptic warnings but no actual information. You weren't briefed because you didn't need to know, Lawrence replied coldly. Your job is to maintain the ranger station and report unusual activities, nothing more. Well, I'm reporting now, I countered. Something is out there, something intelligent, and I think you know exactly what it is. A tense silence followed, broken only by the soft beep of the monitoring equipment. Finally, Lawrence sighed. Ms. Bennett, please continue preparations for our departure. I need a private word with the ranger. Bennett hesitated, then nodded, moving outside with her equipment pack. Lawrence turned to me, his authoritarian demeanor softening slightly. What I'm about to tell you is classified, Ranger. Officially, this conversation never happened. Understood? He lowered his voice, despite Chen and Reyes being occupied on the far side of the room. Lake Wanana has been a research site for nearly 50 years. What began as a standard geological survey in the 1970s quickly became something else when the team encountered anomalous entities. Bigfoot, I said bluntly. Lawrence winced at the term. We avoid that particular nomenclature. We classify them as non-human intelligences, or NHIs. There's a small population in this region, perhaps the largest concentration in North America. How is that possible? How could they remain hidden for so long? They're intelligent, highly adaptable, and extremely territorial. They've learned to avoid human contact, with a few exceptions. He gestured toward the window. This area is ideal. Remote, difficult to access, abundant food sources, and natural features that somehow interfere with technology and human perception. The magnetic anomalies, among other things, we believe they can manipulate their environment in ways we don't fully understand. It's why compasses fail, why satellite phones malfunction, Why people become disoriented in the northern basin. I processed this information, trying to reconcile it with my scientific worldview. If you've known about them for decades, why keep it secret? The scientific significance alone. Lawrence cut me off. Can you imagine the consequences of public confirmation, the media circus, the hordes of cryptid hunters invading the wilderness, not to mention the philosophical and religious implications of another intelligent species sharing our planet? He had a point. The public revelation of such a discovery would be earth-shaking on multiple levels. So what's your role? I asked. Observation, containment, protection, Lawrence replied, surprising me. Both theirs and ours. We maintain this as a sanctuary of sorts, ensuring they remain undisturbed while preventing potentially dangerous interactions with humans. Most hikers or rangers who stumble upon evidence are easy to discredit. A few require more active management. The implication was clear. Is that why rangers keep requesting transfers from this station? Are they being intimidated into leaving? Not by us, Lawrence said meaningfully. The NHIs themselves prefer certain humans over others. They seem to tolerate some, actively avoid most, and occasionally become curious about individuals like yourself. Curious? It tried to break into the cabin last night. If it wanted to enter, it would have. They're testing you, assessing your intentions. The fact that you're still alive suggests they find you interesting. Before I could respond, Bennett appeared at the door. Doctor, we need to depart now if we want to reach the installation before dark. Lawrence nodded. We'll continue this discussion later, Ranger. In the meantime, I strongly suggest you remain in the cabin until we return. The NHIs are more active at night, and they may be agitated by our presence. With that, he joined Bennett outside, and the two departed along the shore toward the peninsula, quickly disappearing into the thick undergrowth. Chen and Reyes continued their work, largely ignoring me except to request coffee or ask basic questions about the cabin's utilities. The monitoring equipment emitted occasional beeps and chirps, but they kept the screens angled away from my view. As darkness fell, I found myself watching the tree line through the window, half expecting to see massive shapes moving in the shadows. The forest remained still, but the sense of being observed was stronger than ever. They're out there, aren't they? I asked, breaking the silence. Reyes glanced up from his equipment. Multiple signatures on thermal, at least 3 individuals, maintaining distance but definitely watching. They always watch, Chen added without looking up from his tablet. It's what they do. And this doesn't concern you? Chen shrugged. We're used to it. They rarely approach when we're here in numbers. They're cautious, especially around unfamiliar technology. But they approached me. Alone. You're new, Reyes explained. They're establishing boundaries, determining if you're a threat. It's a standard pattern. There's nothing standard about a creature that can mimic human speech and create symbolic messages, I countered. This earned me a sharp look from Chen. They mimicked you? What exactly did they say? I recounted the previous night's encounter, the repetition of my words, the utterance of "wanana," the pounding on the window. Chen's professional demeanor cracked slightly, revealing genuine excitement. Fascinating. We've documented limited vocalization before, but direct mimicry of human speech is rare. They must be particularly interested in you. Lucky me, I muttered. The satellite radio on their console crackled to life. Base, this is Lawrence. We've reached the installation. All systems operational, but there are signs of recent NHI activity in the vicinity. Multiple track patterns, some fresh. They've been very active since the storm. Confirmed, Reyes responded. We're tracking 3 signatures around the cabin perimeter, maintaining approximately 200 meters distance. Keep me updated on any changes. We'll remain here overnight to collect data. Lawrence out. As the connection closed, the cabin lights flickered momentarily. Reyes and Chen immediately turned to their equipment, checking readings. Power fluctuation, Chen reported. But the backup systems are stable. They're testing again, Reyes said quietly. Probing our defenses. I thought you said they maintain their distance when you're here, I reminded them. Usually, Chen acknowledged. But they've been increasingly bold over the past year. Something's changed in their behavior patterns. What kind of defenses do you have? I asked, suddenly very interested in our security situation. Reyes pointed to small devices mounted in the corners of the cabin, things I'd initially mistaken for smoke detectors. Acoustic deterrents. They emit frequencies that the NHIs find uncomfortable. Not harmful, just unpleasant enough to discourage close approach. And if those fail? Chen patted a hard-sided case beside his workstation. We have more direct countermeasures if necessary, but it rarely comes to that. The reassurance did little to calm my nerves. I checked my sidearm, ensuring it was loaded and accessible. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving light rain against the windows in irregular patterns. The forest sounds were muted, as if the wildlife sensed the tension and had retreated to safer locations. What do they want? I asked, more to myself than my companions. Chen looked up, his expression serious. That's the question we've been trying to answer for decades. They were here long before us, living in isolation until human expansion began to encroach on their territory. Now they're caught between worlds, unable to fully retreat from human civilization, yet unwilling or unable to reveal themselves completely. Communication attempts have increased in frequency over the past 5 years, Reyes added. The branch symbols, rock arrangements, vocalization experiments. They're trying to establish contact on their terms, or warning us away, I suggested. Perhaps both, Chen conceded. Their social structure and motivations remain largely unknown despite years of observation. We know they're highly intelligent, possess complex communication systems, and demonstrate remarkable adaptability. Beyond that, he shrugged. The lights flickered again, more pronounced this time. One of the monitoring devices emitted a sharp tone. Movement, Reyes reported, studying a thermal display. Their closing distance, all 3 signatures converging on the eastern perimeter. Chen activated a control on his console. A high-pitched whine, just at the edge of human hearing, emanated from the corner devices. I felt it more than heard it, a pressure in my ears that was mildly uncomfortable. That should discourage them, Chen said confidently, but the thermal display told a different story. The signatures continued to approach, undeterred by the acoustic countermeasure. Increase the frequency, Chen instructed. Reyes adjusted a dial, and the pressure in my ears intensified, making me wince. Still, the heat signatures advanced. This isn't right, Reyes muttered. They've never ignored the deterrence before. Chen reached for the hard-sided case, unlatching it to reveal what looked like modified flare guns. We may need to. The cabin plunged into darkness as the power failed completely. Even the battery backup systems went dead. The only illumination came from the faint glow of emergency chemical lights that automatically activated near the exits. In the sudden silence that followed, we could hear them clearly, heavy footsteps circling the cabin, not just 3 sets but many, moving with purpose and coordination. Something heavy dragged across the exterior wall, a deliberate, slow scraping that raised the hairs on my neck. Get down, Chen hissed, distributing the flare guns. Away from the windows, we crouched in the center of the room, back to back, weapons ready. The scraping continued, moving systematically around the structure. Then came the vocalizations, deep, rumbling sounds that overlapped and intertwined, creating patterns that almost, but not quite, resembled language. They're coordinating, Reyes whispered. I've never seen them work together like this. The satellite radio remained silent, no contact from Lawrence and Bennett at the installation. We were on our own. A tremendous blow struck the front door, powerful enough to splinter the frame. Another followed, and the hinges began to separate from the wall. If they breach, aim for the center mass, Chen instructed, his voice remarkably steady. The flares won't kill them, but the light and heat will drive them back. The pounding intensified, the door buckling inward with each impact. Wood cracked, metal groaned, and for the first time, I genuinely believed I might not survive the night. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, the assault stopped. The vocalizations ceased. The forest fell silent. We remained frozen in our defensive posture, waiting for the attack to resume. Minutes stretched into agonizing uncertainty. What happened? I finally whispered. Neither Chen nor Reyes had an answer. We maintained our position, unwilling to investigate but unable to relax. The answer came with the distant thump of helicopter rotors. Reinforcements, Chen breathed, relief evident in his voice. Lawrence must have called for backup when we lost contact. The sound grew louder, and soon the clearing outside was illuminated by powerful searchlights mounted on a military-grade helicopter. The downdraft bent the surrounding trees, creating a maelstrom of wind and rain around the cabin. Voices shouted commands outside. Flashlight beams swept the perimeter. The cavalry had arrived, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The creatures, the NHIs, had been on the verge of breaching the cabin. Why retreat just because of an approaching helicopter? Based on everything I'd witnessed, they were intelligent enough to complete their assault before reinforcements arrived, unless that wasn't their objective at all. As armed personnel secured the area and restored emergency power to the cabin, I stared out the window at the dark forest beyond the helicopter's lights. What had they really wanted? Why coordinate such a show of force only to withdraw at the critical moment? The answer, I suspected, lay somewhere in the northern basin, in the shadow waters of Lake Wanana, where worlds met and ancient intelligences waited. Dawn revealed the extent of the night's events. The cabin's door hung precariously from a single hinge. Deep gouges marked the exterior walls, and massive footprints surrounded the structure in patterns, suggesting at least 6 different individuals had participated in the assault. More disturbing were the symbols, dozens of them, carved into tree trunks, arranged in stone patterns on the ground, even scratched into the cabin's window glass, all variations of the same motif, a vertical line intersected by 3 horizontal strokes. The reinforcements, a specialized security team of 8 personnel, under the command of a stone-faced woman who introduced herself only as Captain, had established a defensive perimeter around the cabin. They carried military-grade weapons and moved with the practiced efficiency of Special Forces operators. Dr. Lawrence and Ms. Bennett had returned from the installation at first light, both looking grim. Lawrence pulled me aside as the security team debriefed Chen and Reyes. The installation was a diversion, he explained, his voice low. While we were there, monitoring equipment recorded unusual activity in the northern basin. We believe they wanted to draw us away from the cabin. Why? I asked, still struggling to understand the creature's motivations. Lawrence hesitated. We're not entirely sure, but given the coordinated nature of their actions, they must have had a specific objective, which was, he glanced toward the lake, expression troubled. Possibly you. Me? Why would they? As I mentioned yesterday, they sometimes develop an interest in specific individuals. Your reports of direct communication attempts suggest you've triggered their curiosity or their hostility. The two aren't mutually exclusive in their culture, Lawrence noted. But if they'd wanted to harm you, they could have easily done so before our arrival. Captain approached, cutting our conversation short. The perimeter is secure, Dr. Lawrence. No signs of immediate threat, but we've detected movement in the forest approximately 1 kilometer north, maintaining distance but watching. Lawrence nodded. Typical behavior after an engagement. We should evacuate while we have the opportunity, she advised. The helicopter can transport everyone to the forward operating base. We can return with a full containment team if necessary. Lawrence considered this, then shook his head. Not yet. I want to understand why they've escalated to this degree. There must be a reason. With respect, Doctor, we can analyze their behavior from a safe distance. The risk of remaining is acceptable, Lawrence interrupted. We've been studying them for decades without a direct confrontation like this. Something has changed, and I need to know what. The captain clearly disapproved but didn't argue further. As you wish, but my team will maintain combat readiness, and the helicopter will remain on standby for immediate extraction. After she departed, Lawrence turned back to me. I need your help, Ranger. You've had more direct interaction with them than anyone on our team. They've attempted communication with you specifically. What exactly do you want me to do? Help us understand what they're trying to convey. These symbols, the vocalizations, it's a language of sorts. We've documented similar patterns over the years, but never in such concentration. I studied one of the carvings on a nearby tree. This doesn't look like any Native American symbology I'm familiar with. It's not, Lawrence confirmed. At least, not exactly. There are similarities to some ancient pictographs found in caves throughout the Pacific Northwest. But these are distinct, and you think I can somehow interpret them? I think they want you to. Why else focus their communication efforts on your cabin? On you specifically? It was a fair question, but one I had no answer for. What did these creatures see in me that made them single me out? Throughout the day, the security team maintained their vigilant perimeter while the researchers documented every symbol, footprint, and mark left by the nocturnal visitors. I assisted where I could, but mostly found myself studying the northern basin across the lake, drawn to it for reasons I couldn't articulate. As evening approached, Lawrence called a briefing in the cabin, now repaired enough to be functional if not comfortable. Maps were spread across the table, monitoring equipment beeped softly in the background, and the security team maintained a visible presence outside. We've analyzed the pattern of activity over the past 72 hours, Lawrence began, highlighting areas on the topographical map. The NHIs have been unusually active here, and here, all concentrated around the northern basin. Additionally, our underwater sensors have detected significant movement beneath the lake's surface. Underwater? I interrupted. These creatures swim? They're highly adapted to this environment, Lawrence explained. We believe they use underwater caves and tunnels to move throughout the region, possibly accessing areas we can't easily monitor. The lake reaches depths of over 300 feet in the northern basin, Chen added. Sonar mapping suggests extensive cave systems beneath the surrounding mountains, many of which may connect to the lake. Lawrence pointed to a specific location on the map, a narrow inlet on the far side of the northern basin, almost entirely enclosed by steep cliffs. This area has shown the most activity. We call it the threshold. Threshold to what? I asked. That's what we've been trying to determine for decades, Lawrence admitted. Native legends speak of Lake Wanana as a boundary between worlds, a place where the veil is thin. Scientifically, We've recorded unusual electromagnetic phenomena there, temporal anomalies, and geological features that don't conform to standard models. You're saying it's what? A doorway to another dimension? Lawrence frowned at my skeptical tone. I'm saying there are aspects of this location that defy conventional explanation. The NHIs seem drawn to it, particularly during certain lunar and solar cycles. Like now, Chen interjected. Tomorrow night's lunar phase coincides with a peak in the electromagnetic field fluctuations we've been monitoring, which may explain their increased activity, Lawrence concluded. They're preparing for something. The captain, who had been listening silently from the doorway, spoke up. All the more reason to evacuate before whatever they're preparing for happens. Lawrence shook his head. This is precisely what we've been waiting years to observe. We're not leaving. Then at least send the ranger out, she insisted. He's not equipped for this level of engagement. All eyes turned to me, waiting for my response. I should have agreed with her, should have jumped at the chance to leave this increasingly dangerous situation. But something held me back, a compulsion I couldn't explain. I'm staying, I heard myself say. Whatever is happening, I'm part of it now. I need to see it through. Lawrence nodded, a hint of satisfaction in his expression. Very well. We'll establish a forward observation post near the threshold tomorrow. If the pattern holds, we should be able to document whatever occurs tomorrow night. The briefing concluded, and the team dispersed to their assigned tasks. I stepped outside, needing fresh air and space to process the surreal turn my assignment had taken. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lake, the water still and black beneath a deepening purple sky. Movement at the forest's edge caught my eye. A dark figure, taller than any human, standing partially concealed among the trees. It made no attempt to hide, watching me with an intelligence I could feel even at this distance. Strangely, I felt no fear, only a profound curiosity that mirrored what I imagined the creature must feel toward me. For a long moment, we observed each other across the clearing, neither making any move to approach or retreat. Then it raised one massive arm, pointing deliberately toward the northern basin before melting back into the forest. An invitation? A warning? Perhaps both. Either way, I knew with certainty that the answers I sought lay across the dark waters, at the place Lawrence had called the threshold. Whatever was going to happen there tomorrow night, I was meant to witness it. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the first frost of the season coating the grass and dock with a crystalline sheen that glittered in the early light. The lake was preternaturally still, like black glass reflecting the surrounding mountains with perfect clarity. Final preparations proceeded with military precision. The security team established a defensive position on a ridge overlooking the threshold, while the research team assembled their monitoring equipment in waterproof cases for transport across the lake. Lawrence assigned me to Bennett's boat, a small craft equipped with specialized sonar and underwater cameras. As we loaded the last of the gear, he pulled me aside one final time. Whatever happens tonight, stay close to the security team, he instructed. The NHIs have shown specific interest in you, which makes you both valuable to our observation and potentially vulnerable. You still haven't told me why they focused on me, I noted. Lawrence's expression was unreadable. Some questions can only be answered through direct experience, Ranger. I believe you'll understand soon enough. With those cryptic words, he joined Captain in the lead boat, and our small flotilla set out across the lake toward the northern basin. The journey was silent, each person lost in their own thoughts as we navigated through the narrow passage that separated the main lake from our destination. The threshold was even more imposing up close. Sheer cliffs rose directly from the water on three sides, creating a natural amphitheater around a small, crescent-shaped beach of black sand. The water here was impossibly clear despite its depth, revealing massive boulders on the lake bed, arranged in what appeared to be deliberate patterns. We secured the boats along the narrow shore, and the security team immediately established a perimeter, setting up surveillance equipment aimed at both the surrounding cliffs and the water itself. The researchers assembled their instruments, Chen directing the placement of sensors along the waterline, while Reyes established a communications relay with the cabin. I found myself drawn to the center of the crescent beach, where a flat stone the size of a small table emerged from the sand. Its surface was covered with weathered carvings, the same three-line symbol we'd found at the cabin, but elaborated into complex interlocking patterns that radiated outward from a central point. An altar of sorts, Lawrence said, appearing beside me. We've carbon-dated organic material from the cracks to approximately 12,000 years ago. These symbols predate all known human settlements in the region. You're suggesting these creatures have been here that long? Perhaps longer. The archaeological record is incomplete, but we've found similar markings in cave systems throughout the Pacific Northwest, always near water sources and always oriented toward specific celestial alignments. He glanced at his watch. We have several hours before sunset. I suggest you familiarize yourself with the area, but stay within visual range of the security team at all times. I spent the afternoon observing the researchers at work, occasionally assisting but mostly trying to make sense of my role in whatever was unfolding. The security team remained vigilant, though no signs of the creatures had been detected since our arrival. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the atmosphere changed. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a thin mist formed across the water's surface, clinging to the lake in defiance of the light breeze. "It's starting," Chen announced, checking his instruments. Electromagnetic fluctuations increasing, just as predicted. The mist thickened as darkness fell, transforming the threshold into a realm of shadows and indistinct forms. Lights were kept to a minimum, red filters on all flashlights to preserve night vision and reduce their visibility from a distance. The security team activated night vision equipment, their quiet reports confirming what we already sensed. We were being surrounded. Heat signatures appeared along the cliff tops, massive forms moving with deliberate stealth to positions overlooking our encampment. "At least 12 individuals," Captain reported, her voice tense but controlled. "More than we've ever documented in one location." Lawrence nodded, excitement evident despite the potential danger. "They're gathering for the event, just as we hypothesized." "What event?" I pressed, no longer willing to accept vague references. Before Lawrence could respond, a low, resonant sound echoed across the water. Not quite a howl, not quite a song, but something between the two. It was answered by another, then another, until the air vibrated with their calls, the acoustics of the enclosed basin amplifying and blending them into an otherworldly chorus. "Vocalization patterns consistent with previous recordings," Chen noted, adjusting his equipment to capture the sounds. "But the amplitude and coordination are unprecedented." The mist swirled and thickened, taking on a faint luminescence that cast everything in an ethereal blue glow. The water in the center of the basin began to move, gentle ripples at first, then more pronounced waves that radiated outward from a central point despite the absence of wind. "Underwater activity," Bennett reported from her position at the sonar station. "Multiple large objects ascending from depth." The security team tightened their formation around us, weapons ready but held low, in a non-threatening posture. Captain's orders had been explicit: no offensive action unless directly attacked. The surface of the lake bulged upward, water cascading off a massive form as it rose from the depths. It wasn't one of the creatures, at least, not as we'd seen them before. It was a structure of some kind, a megalithic arrangement of stones forming a rough archway that now broke the surface in the exact center of the basin. "The gate," Lawrence whispered, awe overriding his scientific detachment. "It's real." As the archway fully emerged, the vocalizations from the surrounding cliffs intensified, taking on a rhythmic quality that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the structure. The mist condensed around the arch, flowing through it like water in reverse, creating a shimmering curtain within its confines. "Electromagnetic readings off the scale," Chen reported, his instruments emitting warning tones. "Quantum fluctuations consistent with theoretical models of space-time distortion." Whatever scientific explanation Chen was attempting, it failed to capture the sheer otherness of what we were witnessing. The arch had become a doorway of sorts, the space within it no longer showing the backdrop of cliffs and night sky, but rather a swirling void of colors and patterns that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. Movement along the shoreline drew our attention. Massive figures emerged from the forest and descended the cliffs, approaching the water's edge. In the ethereal light of the mist, I could see them clearly for the first time. 8 feet tall or more, powerfully built, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. Their faces were almost human in structure, but with pronounced brow ridges, wide-set eyes that reflected the blue glow, and flattened noses above heavy jaws. They carried no weapons or tools, yet moved with a purpose and coordination that spoke of intelligence and social organization far beyond what any wild creature should possess. One of them, larger than the others and with silver streaking its dark fur, approached the water's edge directly across from our position. It locked eyes with me, recognition evident in its gaze. "It knows you," Lawrence murmured, watching the exchange. "The same one that's been observing the cabin, I suspect." The creature broke our eye contact, turning toward the arch in the center of the lake. It raised its arms and emitted a series of complex vocalizations that reverberated across the water. The others joined in, creating a harmonic convergence that seemed to stabilize and intensify the phenomenon within the archway. The security team shifted nervously, but Captain maintained control with hand signals, keeping them in a defensive posture. The researchers worked feverishly, documenting every aspect of the unfolding event. "Look," Bennett gasped, pointing toward the arch. Shapes were visible within the swirling portal, indistinct at first, then resolving into silhouettes that approximated the creatures on the shore, yet subtly different in proportion and movement. They seemed to be approaching from the other side, reaching the threshold but not crossing. The silver-streaked leader waded into the lake, moving with surprising grace through the chest-deep water toward the arch. When it reached the structure, it placed both massive hands on the stone pillars, throwing its head back in what appeared to be an expression of reverence or exultation. The portal flared brighter, the colors shifting rapidly. The shapes within it pressed closer, becoming more distinct with each passing moment. Hands, if they could be called that, reached out, nearly breaking the plane between worlds. "They're coming through," Lawrence stated, his scientific caution momentarily abandoned in the face of what we were witnessing. After all these years of observation, we're finally seeing a full manifestation. But something was wrong. The creature at the arch suddenly stiffened, its posture changing from reverence to alarm. It turned toward us, and even across the distance, I could see fear in its two human eyes. It wasn't the security team that had triggered this reaction. It was something else, something beyond our perception but clearly visible to the creatures. The silver-backed leader bellowed a warning call, and chaos erupted. The creatures on shore retreated toward the forest, their movements no longer measured but urgent, almost panicked. The one by the arch remained, torn between escape and some responsibility to the portal it had helped create. "What's happening?" I demanded, turning to Lawrence. His face had gone pale. "Something's coming through. Something they didn't expect or want." The portal's color shifted to a deep, bloody red, the mist around it darkening and coiling like smoke. The water near the arch began to boil, steam rising in thick plumes that obscured our view. Captain made a decision. "All personnel, fall back to the boats. Prepare for immediate evacuation." The security team began a controlled withdrawal, covering the researchers as they hastily packed essential equipment. But I remained transfixed by the scene unfolding on the lake. The creature at the arch was struggling now, trying to close the portal by pushing the stone pillars together. But whatever force had been awakened was too strong. The archway held firm, and the red glow intensified, casting the creature's desperate efforts in a hellish light. It turned toward me once more, and in that moment, I understood. The connection I'd felt, the reason for its interest in me. We were alike in some fundamental way, both guardians of a sort, both caught between worlds we barely understood. Without conscious decision, I found myself moving forward, wading into the cold water of Lake Wanana. Behind me, Lawrence shouted warnings, and Captain ordered her team to retrieve me. But they seemed distant, irrelevant. The creature and I approached the arch from opposite sides, meeting at the threshold between worlds. Up close, I could see intelligence and emotion in its eyes. Fear, yes, but also determination and something akin to recognition. It vocalized, not the threatening growls from the cabin, but something softer, almost pleading. Though I couldn't understand the specific meaning, the intent was clear. "Help me close it." The portal pulsed, the redness deepening as something massive and formless pressed against the barrier between worlds, seeking entry. The water around the arch churned and steamed, the temperature rising to near boiling despite the night's chill. I placed my hands on the stone pillar opposite the creature, feeling an electric tingle run up my arms. The creature mirrored my position, our eyes meeting across the threshold as we both pushed against the ancient stones. For a moment nothing happened. The pressure from the other side intensified, the formless entity coalescing into something with too many limbs, too many eyes, its very existence an affront to the natural order of our world. Then, as if responding to our combined will, the archway began to move. The stone pillars grudgingly shifted, narrowing the opening. The entity on the other side redoubled its efforts, a high-pitched keening cutting through the night as it realized its opportunity was fading. With one final, desperate surge of strength, the creature and I pushed the pillars together, sealing the doorway between worlds. The red light flashed blindingly bright, then vanished entirely, plunging the basin into darkness broken only by the flashlights of the security team converging on our position. The pressure wave knocked me backward, sending me underwater momentarily. When I surfaced, gasping for breath, the arch was gone, sunk back beneath the lake's surface, leaving only gentle ripples to mark where it had been. On the opposite shore, the creature regarded me for a long moment, its expression unreadable in the sudden darkness. Then it raised one hand in what seemed like a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude, before turning and disappearing into the forest with the others. The security team reached me, half dragging me back to shore where Lawrence waited, his expression a mixture of concern and scientific fascination. "What did you do?" he demanded as Captain's medic checked me for injuries. "What happened out there?" I struggled to find words that could encapsulate the experience. "We closed it," I finally said. "Whatever was trying to come through, it wasn't welcome, not by them, not by us, so we closed the door." Lawrence studied me intently. "You're saying you cooperated with the NHI? Communicated somehow?" "Not with words," I admitted. "But yes, we understood each other. They're not what you think they are, Lawrence. They're not just subjects for your research, anomalous entities to be cataloged and contained. They're guardians of something ancient, something they've protected for thousands of years. Guardians, he repeated, testing the word. That would explain much of their territorial behavior, their aversion to human encroachment. Captain interrupted. All business despite the extraordinary events we'd witnessed. The perimeter team reports all NHI signatures retreating. Whatever was happening appears to be over. We should evacuate while we have the opportunity. Lawrence nodded, his scientific curiosity momentarily overridden by practical concerns. Agreed. Pack only essential equipment. We'll return for the rest once we've analyzed the data. As the team prepared for departure, I stood at the water's edge, gazing out at the now peaceful lake. The mist had dissipated, revealing a sky brilliant with stars. Lake Wanana had reclaimed its secrets, at least for now, but I knew they would return. The creatures, the researchers, perhaps even the entity from beyond the threshold. This ancient place would continue to draw those who sought answers to mysteries beyond human understanding, and as our boats sliced through the dark waters toward the cabin, I realized my path had been irrevocably altered. I could never return to my former life, to routine ranger duties and mundane wilderness management. I had glimpsed something profound at the boundary between worlds, formed a connection with an intelligence not of human origin. Whether I wanted it or not, I had become part of the Shadow Water's endless story, a new guardian at the threshold between worlds. The lake kept its secrets close, revealed them only to those who listened with more than their ears, watched with more than their eyes. I would listen, I would watch, and when the time came again, I would stand ready at the threshold of Wanana, for the shadows always return with the setting sun, and what sleeps beneath the waters will eventually awaken once more. The morning mist clung to the surface of Lake Wanasabi like a shroud, obscuring the dark waters that stretched nearly 3 miles across the valley floor. From my cabin's porch, I could just make out the hulking silhouettes of ancient pines that ringed the opposite shore. My 4th season as a ranger at Wanasabi Wilderness Area was just beginning, and already I felt the familiar mix of reverence and isolation that came with this posting. "Ranger Matthews, come in." The radio on my hip crackled to life, startling a nearby crow that had been eyeing my breakfast. "Matthews here," I responded, setting down my coffee mug on the weathered railing. "Got a situation. Hikers reported strange sounds near Obsidian Ridge last night. One camper hasn't returned to their group. Possible lost hiker. Can you check it out?" "Copy that. Heading there now." I gathered my gear methodically. First aid kit, topographic maps, GPS unit, extra water, emergency rations, flares, and my sidearm. Standard procedure for search operations, though firearm use was exceedingly rare, mostly for aggressive wildlife, black bears or mountain lions that occasionally threatened visitors, or so I had always believed. The drive to Obsidian Ridge trailhead took nearly an hour on unpaved Forest Service roads. The Wanasabi Wilderness stretched across 500,000 acres of the most remote forest land in the Pacific Northwest. Some areas hadn't seen human footprints in decades. Native legends claimed the forest harbored ancient spirits, guardians who protected the land from intrusion. The local tribes had named it Wanasabi, Place of Shadows. At the trailhead, I met the hiking group, 3 college students, wide-eyed and jittery. Their friend, a guy named Alex, had wandered off during the night to take pictures of the stars and never returned. "We heard noises," one of them said, a tall, thin guy who couldn't stop fidgeting with his backpack straps. "Not an animal. At least, not like any animal I've ever heard." "What did it sound like?" I asked, pulling out my notebook. The young woman in the group hugged herself against the morning chill. "Like wood breaking, but rhythmic. And then this low sound, almost like moaning, but deeper, much deeper than a human voice could go." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "How long has Alex been missing?" "About 6 hours now," the third hiker replied. "We tried calling for him, but..." He trailed off, glancing nervously at the dense forest. "You did the right thing by reporting it," I assured them. "I'll find your friend. Wait at the ranger station down the road. Someone will drive you back to the visitor center." After they left, I studied the topographic map. Obsidian Ridge was steep terrain with numerous ravines where someone could fall and become injured. Simple explanation. But something about their description of the sounds nagged at me. The trail soon narrowed, climbing steadily through old-growth forest. Massive trees blocked most of the morning sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. I called out periodically, my voice swallowed by the dense vegetation. "Alex, Ranger Service, can you hear me?" 3 hours into the search, I found the first sign of disturbance. A clearing where the undergrowth had been flattened in a circular pattern about 15 feet in diameter. In the center lay a backpack, its contents scattered. A camera with a cracked lens, energy bar wrappers, a water bottle. I photographed everything before examining the ground more closely. The soil was soft from recent rain, and the impressions were unmistakable. Footprints, but not from hiking boots. These were enormous, easily 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions. They were deep, suggesting tremendous weight. My pulse quickened as I followed the prints to the edge of the clearing, where they disappeared into thicker forest. That's when I noticed the smell, a powerful musky odor unlike anything I'd encountered before. Not bear, not elk, something else entirely. I radioed back to headquarters. Matthews reporting. Found missing hikers' belongings at coordinates 45.28 minus 121.79. Proceeding to search immediate vicinity. Requesting backup. Static answered me. I tried again, adjusting the frequency. Nothing. The dense terrain often created dead zones for radio communication, but I'd never had problems in this area before. The light was already beginning to fade when I found the tree. An enormous pine, at least 6 feet in diameter, snapped clean through about 10 feet from the ground. Not cut, broken, with jagged splinters protruding from both sections. The top portion lay across the trail, needles still green. This was recent. No storm could have done this. No natural force short of a tornado could snap a healthy tree of this size. As I stood examining the destruction, the forest fell completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it, the wood-breaking sound the hikers had described. Crack, pause, crack, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere ahead of me on the trail. I switched off my flashlight instinctively, crouching beside the fallen tree. Crack, closer now. Something large was moving through the forest, breaking branches as it came. My hand moved to my sidearm, though I knew it would be woefully inadequate against anything powerful enough to snap trees. A low rumble vibrated through the ground, not quite a growl, deeper than any bear could produce. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, resonating in my chest cavity. I'd spent my entire adult life in wilderness areas, encountered everything from grizzlies to wolf packs, but nothing had ever filled me with such primal dread. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I made a decision that went against all my training. I retreated, moving as quietly as possible back down the trail. Whatever was out there, I wasn't equipped to handle it alone in the dark. Alex would have to survive the night. I hoped he'd found shelter. The hike back to my vehicle seemed interminable, each shadow between the trees taking on menacing proportions. Several times I paused, certain I heard heavy footsteps paralleling my course through the woods. But I saw nothing, even when sweeping my flashlight across the undergrowth. Back at my cabin, I radioed in my findings, careful to stick to the facts without interpretation. Missing hiker, signs of struggle, unusual damage to vegetation. I didn't mention the footprints, didn't mention the smell. Some things you have to see to believe, and I wasn't ready to be the ranger who cried Bigfoot. As I prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My cabin sat on a small clearing overlooking the lake, windows facing the water and the forest beyond. I double-checked the locks, something I rarely bothered with in this remote location. Just as I was about to turn off the light, something caught my eye through the window. A shadow, darker than the night, moving at the forest edge. Too large to be human, too upright to be a bear. For just a moment, it seemed to turn toward the cabin, and I glimpsed what might have been eyes reflecting the distant moonlight. Then it was gone, melting into the darkness between the ancient trees of Wanasabi. Sleep did not come easily that night. Dawn broke with a heavy mist hanging over Lake Wanasabi, obscuring the far shore entirely. I'd spent a restless night reviewing what I'd seen, trying to rationalize my experience into something that fit my understanding of the world. Perhaps Alex had encountered a bear, explaining the destruction and his disappearance. Perhaps the footprints were actually overlapping tracks from multiple animals. Perhaps the stress of the search had affected my perception. But deep down, I knew better. I was brewing coffee when my radio crackled to life. "Matthews, do you copy? The search team is assembled at headquarters. ETA to your location 30 minutes. Copy that," I responded, relieved that reinforcements were coming. "I'll meet you at the Obsidian Ridge trailhead." The drive back to the ridge felt different in daylight, though no less ominous. I parked at the trailhead and waited, scanning the forest edge. In the light of day, I questioned my decision to leave the search area the previous evening. It went against every protocol, but some primal instinct had overridden my training. The search team arrived. 2 other rangers and a local search and rescue volunteer with a tracking dog, a German shepherd named Rex. I briefed them on what I'd found, still omitting my more unusual observations. "Let's split into 2 teams, suggested Ranger Rivera, the most experienced among us. "Matthews and I will return to the last known location with Rex. Roberts and Johnson, take the eastern ravine in case he fell. We hiked back to the clearing where I'd found the backpack. Rex became agitated almost immediately, whining and circling rather than tracking a scent trail. "What's wrong with him?" I asked the handler. "Never seen him act like this," the man responded, frowning. "It's like there's too many conflicting scents, or something's masking the trail." Rivera knelt to examine the ground, then looked up at me sharply. "What are these tracks, Matthews? You didn't mention footprints this size in your report." I hesitated. I wasn't sure what to make of them. She traced the outline of one print with her finger. "These are unusual. They continue into the forest," I said, pointing toward where I found the broken tree. Rivera stood, her expression unreadable. "Show me." We proceeded deeper into the forest, Rex still behaving erratically, until we reached the snapped pine. In daylight, the damage was even more impressive and concerning. The break wasn't weather smooth but jagged, as if the massive trunk had been twisted until it gave way. "What could do this?" Rivera whispered, running her hand over the splintered wood. Before I could answer, our radios crackled with Robert's voice. "We found something. Eastern ravine, about half a mile from the ridge. You'd better come see this." We found Roberts and Johnson standing beside a small stream, looking grim. On the muddy bank lay a single hiking boot, Alex's presumably, and scattered pieces of torn clothing. Blood darkened the rocks nearby. "No sign of him?" Rivera asked. Roberts shook his head. "Just this. But look at the trees." He pointed across the stream. 3 pines, each at least 100 years old, had been snapped at various heights. Beyond them, a path of destruction led deeper into the forest. Broken undergrowth, uprooted saplings, disturbed earth. "It's like something dragged him through here," Johnson said quietly. "Something big." Rivera turned to me. "Those tracks you found, did they lead in this direction?" I nodded slowly. The implications hung in the air, unspoken but understood by all of us. Whatever had taken Alex wasn't a conventional predator. "We need more people," Rivera decided. "And better equipment." "Should we follow the trail?" Roberts asked, clearly reluctant. Rivera hesitated, then shook her head. "Not without backup. This is beyond our usual search parameters." As we debated our next move, Rex suddenly growled, a deep, threatening sound I'd never heard from a search dog. His hackles rose as he stared into the forest beyond the stream. "What is it, boy?" the handler murmured, tightening his grip on the leash. A branch snapped in the distance, then another, closer. The rhythmic cracking I'd heard the night before returned, moving parallel to our position. "Everyone back to the trail," Rivera ordered quietly. Now, we retreated, moving as quickly as we could while maintaining silence. Rex continued to growl softly, his eyes fixed on the forest to our right, where something large seemed to be keeping pace with us, just out of sight. The 5-minute walk back to the main trail felt like hours. Once there, Rivera made a call on her satellite phone, requesting immediate assistance from state authorities. Her voice remained professional, but I could hear the underlying tension as she described finding evidence of predator activity and unusual environmental damage. Back at headquarters, we gathered around a topographic map, marking the areas we'd searched and the location of our findings. The other teams had returned empty-handed. "Whatever we're dealing with," Rivera said after the briefing, "it's not in our standard playbook." That evening, state wildlife officials arrived, along with 2 men in unmarked SUVs, who identified themselves only as specialists from a federal resource management agency. They interviewed each of us separately, paying particular attention to my account since I'd been first on scene. One of the specialists, a gray-haired man with weathered features, showed unusual interest in my description of the footprints and the strange sounds. "You've worked wilderness areas for how long?" he asked. 7 years, I replied. 4 here at Wanasabi. "Ever seen anything like this before?" I shook my head. "But you've heard the stories, I assume, about what supposedly lives in these forests?" I met his gaze evenly. "Every wilderness area has its legends. I deal in facts." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer. "We'll take over the search from here. Your team has been reassigned to visitor management. Keep people out of the northern quadrant until further notice." "What about Alex?" I pressed. "His friends deserve answers." "We'll handle it," he said firmly. "Official statement is that it was a bear attack. Tragic but not uncommon." "That wasn't a bear," I said before I could stop myself. The specialist leaned forward. "No," he agreed quietly. "It wasn't. But bear attack is what goes in the report. Understood?" I understood then that I'd stumbled into something larger than a missing hiker case, something the authorities preferred to keep classified. The realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the evening air. That night I returned to my cabin, now accompanied by an uneasy awareness that Wanasabi held secrets I was only beginning to glimpse. As darkness fell, I stood on my porch, listening to the forest sounds with new attentiveness. From across the lake came a long, mournful howl, not a wolf, not a coyote, but something that raised goosebumps on my arms. It echoed across the water, seeming to penetrate the walls of my cabin and vibrate in my chest. I knew then that I couldn't simply walk away from this mystery, regardless of official directives. Alex was still out there, or what remained of him, and whatever had taken him was still hunting in my forest. The specialists might have their agenda, but I had responsibilities of my own. As I prepared for bed, I began making mental notes of the equipment I would need for my own investigation. Tomorrow, I decided, I would return to Obsidian Ridge alone, this time prepared for whatever awaited me in the ancient shadows of Wanasabi. Morning brought a heavy downpour that drummed against the cabin roof, matching my somber mood. The rain would wash away tracks, scents, and any remaining evidence, convenient for those who wanted this incident buried, inconvenient for my unsanctioned investigation. I called headquarters to report that I was taking a personal day, claiming a migraine. Rivera didn't sound convinced but didn't press the issue. The specialists had established a command post at the visitor center, effectively taking over operations. Most of the regular staff had been reassigned to the southern sections of the park. Once the call ended, I gathered my gear with careful deliberation. This wasn't a standard search and rescue mission anymore. This was something else entirely. I packed heavier provisions, emergency shelter, a more robust first aid kit, and my personal hunting knife. I hesitated before adding my off-duty sidearm, a .44 Magnum revolver with stopping power that far exceeded my service weapon. Against my better judgment, I included a small digital recorder. If I was going to violate protocols, I might as well document my findings. The drive to Obsidian Ridge was treacherous in the downpour, mud sliding beneath my tires as I navigated the service road. I parked half a mile from the official trailhead, concealing my vehicle behind a stand of young hemlocks. The last thing I needed was for the specialist to discover my presence. The rain had reduced visibility to about 50 yards, transforming the forest into a gray labyrinth of dripping vegetation. I orientated myself using my GPS unit and set off toward the ravine where we'd found Alex's boot. The going was slow and miserable. Waterlogged ground turned the trail into a muddy creek, and twice I nearly lost my footing on slick rocks. But the weather provided one advantage. The drumming rain masked any sounds I might make, potentially allowing me to move undetected. By midday, I reached the stream where we'd made our grim discovery. The area had been altered. Someone had removed the boot and clothing fragments, and I noticed small flags marking various points of interest. The specialists had been thorough. I followed the path of destruction we'd observed the previous day, moving cautiously through the damaged undergrowth. The trail led northward, deeper into the wilderness area, away from established hiking routes. After about a mile, I noticed the forest beginning to change. The trees here were older, massive trunks stretching toward a canopy that blocked much of the rain. Moss hung in thick curtains, and the undergrowth thinned, suggesting fewer disturbances over time. The trail of broken vegetation ended abruptly at the base of a sheer cliff face that rose nearly 100 feet. Water cascaded down its surface in dozens of small waterfalls created by the rain. I consulted my map, confirming what I already suspected. I had reached the edge of what rangers informally called the Quiet Zone, a section of the wilderness that remained largely unexplored due to its rugged terrain and lack of established trails. I scanned the cliff base, looking for any sign of where the trail might continue. About 50 yards to my right, a dark opening appeared in the rock face, the entrance to what appeared to be a cave. Approaching cautiously, I detected that same musky odor I'd noticed earlier, now stronger despite the rain. The cave mouth was roughly circular, about 8 feet in diameter, with worn smooth edges suggesting long use. Fresh scratches marked the stone around the entrance. I switched on my flashlight and stepped just inside the opening, allowing my eyes to adjust to the darkness. The cave extended back into the cliff, widening as it went. The floor was surprisingly level and clear of debris, as if it had been deliberately maintained. Something crunched under my boot. I directed my light downward and immediately stepped back. Bones, dozens of them, lay scattered near the walls of the cave. Most appeared to be from deer or elk, but some were unmistakably human. The skull, partially crushed, rested against the cave wall, empty eye sockets staring accusingly at the intruder who had disturbed its rest. My hand moved to my sidearm instinctively. I should leave, report this location to the authorities, regardless of their agenda. But something compelled me forward, a need to understand what was happening in my forest. The cave extended about 30 feet before opening into a larger chamber. And there, illuminated by a shaft of gray daylight from some opening in the ceiling, lay a scene that defied rational explanation. A crude structure occupied the center of the chamber, a shelter built from woven branches and what appeared to be animal hides. Surrounding it were artifacts that spoke of primitive intelligence, tools fashioned from bone and stone, containers made from hollowed wood, and most disturbingly, items of obvious human origin. A wristwatch, a boot that matched the one we'd found, tattered clothing arranged in what almost appeared to be a deliberate display. I activated my recorder, whispering descriptions of what I was seeing, knowing how incredible it would sound. This wasn't the random collection of a scavenging animal. This was a dwelling. As I documented the scene, I became aware of a rhythmic sound echoing through the cave, not the cracking of wood this time, but a slow dripping from the ceiling. The chamber had fallen unnaturally silent otherwise, the usual subterranean sounds of water and shifting stone absent. Then I realized the dripping had pattern. It was too regular, too measured. I turned slowly, directing my light toward the sound. In the darkest corner of the chamber, partially concealed by a natural column of stone, something moved. Something massive, something watching. I caught only glimpses as it shifted position. Matted hair covering enormous limbs, a sloped shoulder that brushed the ceiling nearly 9 feet above the floor, eyes that reflected my light with an amber glow that spoke of intelligence and primal anger. My light beam caught a flash of pale color clutched in what might have been a hand, a scrap of fabric that I recognized with horrified certainty as the shirt Alex had been wearing in the photos his friends had shown me. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we regarded each other across the cave, ranger and legend, human and something that defied classification. I felt a pressure building in my skull, a sensation that transcended ordinary fear, and approached some deeper, genetic memory of being prey. Then it moved. What followed exists in my memory as fragmented impressions rather than a coherent sequence. The creature, for I have no better word, lunged not toward me but deeper into the cave system, moving with shocking speed for its size. I caught impressions of massive limbs, a head that seemed to sit directly on sloped shoulders, and that overwhelming musky scent. I retreated, nearly falling in my haste to reach the cave entrance. Outside, the rain had intensified, reducing visibility to mere yards. I ran blindly, abandoning the careful tracking that had brought me here, focused only on putting distance between myself and the cave. How long I ran, I cannot say. Eventually, physical exhaustion forced me to stop, collapsing against the trunk of an enormous cedar. My lungs burned, and my legs trembled with fatigue and residual terror. I had dropped my pack somewhere in the flight, retaining only my sidearm and the recorder clutched in a white-knuckled grip. As my breathing slowed, I became aware of my surroundings once more. The forest had changed again. The trees here were arranged in an almost circular pattern around a small clearing. At the center stood a weathered stone structure, roughly 4 feet high, carved with symbols I didn't recognize. An altar of some kind, perhaps, or a boundary marker from some forgotten era. I approached it cautiously, running my fingers over the worn carvings. Among them, one stood out with disturbing clarity, a crude but recognizable depiction of a figure, massive and hunched, with long arms and a suggestion of thick hair covering its body. The stone felt warm beneath my touch despite the cool rain, as if it retained some inner heat. And as I examined the carvings more closely, I realized some of them weren't ancient at all. Fresh marks had been added recently, the exposed stone lighter than the weathered surface around it. Someone, or something, was maintaining this marker. Communicating through it, perhaps, in a language I couldn't begin to comprehend. The realization that I was standing in what might be a ritual site used by the creature from the cave spurred me back into motion. I needed to return to civilization, to process what I had seen and decide what to do with the knowledge. The rain finally ceased as evening approached, and I managed to orient myself using landmarks and my compass. I had lost my GPS unit along with my pack, but years of wilderness experience guided me back toward the ranger station. Night was falling as I emerged from the forest near the service road, about 2 miles from where I had parked. As I trudged along the muddy track, headlights appeared around a bend, an unmarked SUV identical to those the specialists had arrived in. I stepped off the road, concealing myself behind a fallen log. The vehicle slowed as it approached, spotlights mounted on its roof sweeping the forest edge. They were searching for something, or someone. The SUV passed without stopping, but its presence confirmed my suspicions. The authorities knew more than they were admitting about what lived in Wanasabi. This wasn't a new discovery, but an ongoing situation they were monitoring and concealing from the public. I waited until the vehicle disappeared around the next bend before continuing, now moving through the forest parallel to the road, rather than on it. By the time I reached my hidden vehicle, full darkness had fallen, and a new sound echoed through the forest. The distinctive whump-whump of helicopter rotors, somewhere to the north. Whatever I had stirred up with my intrusion had prompted a significant response. As I drove carefully back toward my cabin, I replayed the recorder, half expecting to find it empty, some cruel trick of an overwrought imagination. But there it was, my breathless narration of the cave's contents, followed by a sound that made me nearly drive off the road, a deep, rumbling vocalization that had not registered in my conscious memory during the encounter. A language, perhaps, or a warning. Evidence, at minimum, that what I had seen was real. Back at my cabin, I secured the doors and windows, though I harbored no illusions that such measures would stop the creature if it decided to come for me. I transferred the recording to my laptop and wrote detailed notes of everything I had observed, from the cave dwelling to the stone marker in the forest. As I worked, a new conviction formed in my mind. The specialists weren't just covering up the existence of an unclassified species, they were protecting it. The question was why, and what connection it might have to the ancient tribes who had named this wilderness the place of shadows. Tomorrow, I decided, I would seek answers from the only source likely to speak truthfully, the tribal elders whose ancestors had lived alongside whatever stalked the forests of Wanasabi, long before rangers and specialists arrived to manage the wilderness. The tribal cultural center sat at the edge of the reservation, about 40 miles from Wanasabi's main entrance. I arrived shortly after it opened, having called in sick for the second consecutive day. My phone had been buzzing with messages from Rivera and, more concerning, from the specialists, but I had ignored them all. The center was quiet, just a few visitors examining displays of traditional crafts and historical photographs. I approached an elderly woman arranging pamphlets at the information desk, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, turquoise jewelry adorning her wrists and neck. "I need to speak with someone about Wanasabi," I said quietly, showing my ranger badge. "About its history and legends." She studied me for a long moment, her dark eyes revealing nothing. "Why does a park ranger need to know old stories?" she asked finally. "I've seen something," I admitted. "Something I can't explain." She nodded slowly, as if my words confirmed a suspicion. "Wait here." She disappeared through a door marked "Staff Only," returning minutes later. "Come," she said simply, holding the door open. She led me to a small conference room where an elderly man sat at a table, his weathered hands resting on a carved wooden cane. He nodded at the chair across from him. "This is Bernard Whitefeather," the woman said. "Tribal historian. If anyone can answer your questions, it's him." She left, closing the door behind her. "You've seen the Guardian," Whitefeather said without preamble, his voice surprisingly strong despite his apparent age. I hesitated, then nodded. "In a cave near the northern cliff face. It had collected things, human things, and now the government men are scrambling," he said with a hint of satisfaction. "They think they can control everything with their protocols and classifications." "What is it?" I asked. "Some undiscovered species." Whitefeather tapped his cane against the floor. "Not undiscovered. Known to my people since before Europeans came to these lands. We called them Sakwan, the Elder Brothers. They were here first, and they will remain when humans have gone." "It killed a hiker," I said. "Took him to its cave." "Perhaps," Whitefeather conceded. "Or perhaps the hiker violated boundaries he should not have crossed. The Sakwan are territorial, and they understand more than you might think. They watch, they learn, they remember." "The specialists know about them," I said. "They're covering it up." "Of course. They've known since the 1970s when they first established a research station within the wilderness area. They study the Sakwan from a distance, document their movements, occasionally retrieve their dead when one dies. All very scientific." He spoke the last word with undisguised contempt. "Why keep it secret? This would be the zoological discovery of the century." Whitefeather laughed, a dry sound like autumn leaves rustling. "Can you imagine what would happen if the world learned that creatures from mankind's darkest folklore actually exist? That something stronger, older, and possibly smarter than humans has been living alongside us, watching us? The specialists understand what my people have always known. Some truths are better left in shadow." "How many are there?" I asked, trying to process his words. "No one knows exactly. They migrate through vast territories, following ancient paths. But Wanasabi has always been special to them. Sacred, you might say. The stone markers you saw in the forest, they were placed there centuries ago, a boundary agreement between my ancestors and the Sakwan." I stared at him. "How did you know about the stone markers?" He smiled slightly. "Because I was taken to see them as a child, just as my grandfather was, and his grandfather before him. Some of us are chosen to remember, to maintain the old ways, to respect the boundaries. The authorities don't respect those boundaries," I pointed out. "They've built roads, visitor centers, hiking trails, and notice how many accidents occur each year in certain areas. Notice which sections of the wilderness remain closed due to unstable terrain or sensitive habitat. The specialists may use different words, but the result is the same. keeping humans away from Sakwan territory. I thought about the northern quadrant, perpetually restricted for various bureaucratic reasons that changed each season. It made a disturbing kind of sense. What should I do with what I know? I asked finally. Whitefeather studied me. You have seen what few outsiders ever see and live to speak of it. The Sakwan could have taken you in that cave, but it did not. That suggests you might have a role to play. What role? My people have always had those who walked between worlds, human and spirit, civilization and wilderness. Perhaps you are such a bridge. Before I could press him further, the door opened. The woman from the information desk entered, her expression grave. There are men looking for him, she said to Whitefeather, nodding toward me. Government types. 2 vehicles in the parking lot. I stood quickly. Is there another way out? Whitefeather pointed his cane toward a side door. Through the cultural archives, then the loading dock. My granddaughter will show you. As I moved to follow her, he caught my arm. The Sakwan respect courage and honesty. If you return to the forest, go openly. Take no weapons. Bring an offering. Food left at the stone marker. Speak aloud your intentions. Will it understand? Better than you might think, he replied. They've been watching us for thousands of years. Some say they can even take things from our minds without words. The woman, Whitefeather's granddaughter apparently, led me through a room filled with artifacts in glass cases, then down a hallway to a metal door that opened onto a small loading area behind the building. My car's out front, I said, realizing I was effectively trapped. Take mine, she offered, handing me a set of keys. The blue truck in the corner. I'll retrieve yours later. As I took the keys, she added, my grandfather doesn't suggest offerings lightly. If you go back, follow his advice exactly. The Sakwan don't give second chances. I thanked her and slipped out, making my way to an aged blue pickup. As I pulled away from the cultural center, I glimpsed 2 men in dark suits entering the main entrance. The specialists had tracked me down faster than I'd anticipated. I took back roads toward Wanasabi, my mind racing through everything Whitefeather had told me. If he was right, if the Sakwan were an intelligent species that had coexisted with humans for millennia, then the implications were staggering. But one question remained paramount. What had happened to Alex? Was he dead, a victim of territorial aggression? Or was there some other explanation for his disappearance? I needed to return to the forest, to the cave. But this time, I would follow Whitefeather's advice and go without weapons, bearing an offering instead of threats. First, though, I needed supplies and a plan for evading the specialists who were clearly monitoring my movements. I drove to a small town about 30 miles from the wilderness area, where I purchased food items for the offering, fresh fruit, bread, and salted meat that would travel well. I also bought basic camping supplies to replace what I'd lost during my panicked flight from the cave. As evening approached, I drove toward a rarely used fire service road that provided back access to Wanasabi's northern section. The road was gated and locked, but as a ranger, I had keys to all the maintenance entrances. If the specialists were watching the main roads, this might allow me to slip in unobserved. The plan worked better than I'd hoped. I parked the borrowed truck in a maintenance shed about 2 miles from my cabin, then proceeded on foot through the gathering darkness. From a ridge overlooking the ranger station, I could see unusual activity, additional vehicles, portable equipment set up outside, and personnel moving with the disciplined precision of military rather than civilian authorities. Whatever I had stumbled upon had escalated significantly during my absence. I circled wide around the developed area, approaching my cabin from the lakeside, rather than the main path. Inside, I moved quickly, gathering essential supplies and checking my computer. As I'd suspected, someone had been there. Subtle signs of a search were evident in slightly misplaced items and a chair not pushed in completely. I downloaded my notes and the recording to a flash drive, then deleted the originals. As an afterthought, I left a false trail, a hastily written note suggesting I was heading to the nearest city to speak with a journalist friend. Supplies packed and offering secured, I slipped back into the forest. Night had fully fallen, but the nearly full moon provided enough light to navigate by. I would camp in the forest tonight and make my way to the stone marker at dawn. As I hiked, I felt a strange calm descend. Fear remained, certainly, but beneath it lay a growing sense of purpose. Whitefeather's words about being a bridge echoed in my mind. Perhaps there was a reason I had been drawn to this wilderness, to this particular ranger posting, years before. I made camp in a small hollow well off any established trail, not bothering with a fire that might attract attention. As I lay in my sleeping bag staring up at stars visible through gaps in the canopy, I whispered aloud my intentions: to understand, not to harm; to listen, not to judge. If the Sakwan truly could take thoughts from human minds, as Whitefeather had suggested, then perhaps it already knew I was coming. Perhaps it was watching even now from the darkness between the trees. The thought should have terrified me, Instead, I found myself oddly comforted by the possibility that I was not truly alone in the vast wilderness. With that unsettling thought, I drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of stone markers and amber eyes watching from shadows. I awoke before dawn to the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. The search had intensified. I packed quickly and continued north, staying beneath the thick canopy where I would be invisible from the air. By mid-morning, I reached the circular clearing with the stone marker. In daylight, the site appeared even more deliberately arranged, the surrounding trees unnaturally uniform in their spacing. I approached the marker slowly, setting my pack aside and removing the offering I had brought. Following instinct as much as Whitefeather's instructions, I placed the food items at the base of the stone, arranging them with care rather than simply dumping them. Then I stood back, hands open at my sides, and spoke aloud to the seemingly empty forest. I am Ranger Matthews of Wanasabi Wilderness. I come seeking understanding, not conflict. I have seen your dwelling. I know you are watchers of this land, as I am in my own way. I ask to speak with you about the human who entered your territory. My words hung in the still air, feeling simultaneously foolish and profound. Nothing moved in the forest around me. No response came. I waited an hour, then two, sitting cross-legged near the marker, but not so close as to appear threatening. The forest continued its normal activities. Birds called, small animals rustled in the undergrowth, insects buzzed in the warming air. Just as I was beginning to think Whitefeather had sent me on a fool's errand, I noticed the change. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. The forest was falling silent in a wave that approached from the north, as if something was moving through it, causing every living thing to pause in momentary respect or fear. I rose slowly to my feet, heart pounding but determined not to show fear. From the deepest shadows between ancient trunks, a figure emerged, massive, over 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick reddish-brown hair. It moved with a fluid grace that belied its size, each step deliberate and silent despite its weight. The Sequan had come to hear me, and now I had to find the courage to face it and speak of murder and territory, of boundaries and respect, with a creature straight from mankind's oldest nightmares. The Sequan halted at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the shadow of an enormous pine. Even at this distance, its presence was overwhelming, a palpable weight in the air, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. I fought the urge to retreat as it took another step forward, now fully visible in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. My first clear look at the creature challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It stood upright but with a slight forward stoop, massive shoulders hunched beneath a thick coat of auburn hair. Its face combined features that seemed both ape-like and disturbingly human. A prominent brow ridge shadowed deep-set eyes, a wide nose with flaring nostrils, and a mouth that appeared capable of both bestial snarls and deliberate expressions. Those eyes, amber with vertical pupils like a cat's, fixed on me with unmistakable intelligence. Not the simple curiosity of a bear or the predatory assessment of a mountain lion, but something that spoke of thought, of judgment, of memory. It tilted its head slightly, examining me as I examined it. Then it did something I never expected. It raised one massive hand, palm outward, in what could only be interpreted as a greeting, or perhaps a gesture of peace. Finding my voice, I raised my own hand in mirror response. "I come with respect," I said, the words emerging steadier than I felt. "I seek understanding about the human who entered your territory." The Sequan made a low sound, not quite a growl, more like the rumble of distant thunder. It pointed to the stone marker, then to itself, then swept its arm in a wide arc that encompassed the surrounding forest. The meaning seemed clear enough. "This is my territory, marked by the stone." "I understand," I responded. "But the human," I hesitated, unsure how to communicate the concept of a missing person to a being that might not share human values regarding life. The creature moved closer, now just 20 feet away. I held my ground despite every instinct screaming at me to run. It pointed at me, then made a gesture like something small and quick moving through the forest. "Yes, humans come here," I acknowledged. "Visitors, but one is missing, taken." I mimed someone being carried away. The Sequan watched my pantomime, then made a sound that startled me, a series of clicks and deep vocalizations that had structure, rhythm, patterns, language. It pointed to the offering I had left, then back toward the direction of its cave, making the carrying motion I had just demonstrated. Understanding dawned. "You took him to your cave," I said. "But why? Was he threatening you?" The creature approached the stone marker, moving with a grace incongruous with its bulk. It knelt before the carved surface, massive fingers tracing one of the symbols, a spiral pattern that I hadn't noticed before. Then it pointed toward the sky, making a circular motion. I struggled to interpret. "Time? Cycles? Seasons?" It repeated the gesture more emphatically, adding a new element, pointing to the spiral, then to its chest, then making a rocking motion with its arms. An impossible thought formed in my mind. A child? You have a child? The Saquon repeated the rocking gesture, then pointed again in the direction of its cave. There's a young one in the cave, I said slowly, trying to process the implications. And Alex, the human, did he threaten your child? The creature bared its teeth briefly, not in aggression I sensed, but to communicate strong emotion. It picked up a stick and snapped it sharply, then pointed toward where a helicopter's distant thrumming could be heard. He brought danger. I translated. Attention from the outside. The Saquon nodded, an unmistakably human gesture that sent a shiver through me. It had been watching us, learning our movements, our expressions for who knew how long. Is he alive? I asked, the question that had haunted me since discovering the cave. The creature made a gesture I couldn't interpret, then pointed toward the north again, beyond the direction of its cave. He's somewhere else? You moved him? Another nod, followed by a series of gestures, pointing to its eyes, then to the forest, then a walking motion with its fingers. You're watching him? Keeping him somewhere? The Saquon made a sound that might have been affirmation, then pointed at me, at itself, and made a motion like two people walking side by side. The meaning hit me with stunning clarity. You want me to go with you? The creature extended its massive hand, palm up, an invitation impossible to misinterpret. Time seemed to freeze as I considered my options. I could refuse, retreat to the ranger station, report everything I had learned to the specialists. They clearly had protocols for these situations, containment procedures, perhaps even communication methods more sophisticated than my crude gestures. But I remembered Whitefeather's words about being a bridge between worlds, about the Saquon choosing who they revealed themselves to, about respect and courage. I'll come with you, I said, stepping forward to accept whatever fate awaited. The creature turned and moved into the forest, glancing back to ensure I followed. Its pace was deliberate, accommodating my slower human movements. We traveled in silence through terrain that grew increasingly rugged and unfamiliar. After about 2 hours, we approached a ridgeline I didn't recognize from any of the park maps. The Saquon led me along its base to a narrow crevice in the rock face, barely visible behind a stand of young trees. It gestured for me to enter first, a test of trust I couldn't refuse at this point. I squeezed through the opening, finding myself in a narrow passage that quickly widened into a small cavern, illuminated by patches of sunlight streaming through cracks in the ceiling. And there, sitting on a crude bed of grasses and what appeared to be torn sleeping bag material, was Alex. He looked up as I entered, eyes widening in shock. Ranger Matthews? He croaked, voice hoarse from disuse or screaming, I couldn't tell which. Are you real? I'm real, I assured him, quickly scanning for injuries. Besides looking malnourished and disheveled, he appeared physically intact. Are you hurt? Before he could answer, the Saquon ducked through the entrance, its massive frame nearly filling the small cave. Alex shrank back against the wall, terror plain on his face. It's okay, I said, though the words sounded absurd even to my own ears. I think it's been protecting you. Protecting? Alex laughed, a brittle sound on the edge of hysteria. It dragged me through the forest, kept me prisoner. I thought it was saving me for food. The Saquon made a disgusted sound, startling us both. It moved to a corner of the cave where a collection of objects lay, including Alex's backpack. It rummaged through the pack, pulling out Alex's camera. With surprising delicacy for such massive hands, the creature turned the camera on and navigated to the stored images. It brought the device to me, pointing at the screen. The photo showed a small clearing different from the one with the stone marker. At its center was what appeared to be a nest made of branches and moss, and within it, a smaller version of the Saquon, a juvenile, unmistakably. I showed the image to Alex. You photographed its child, I said quietly. Probably wandered into a nursery area. I didn't know, he whispered. I was just hiking, taking pictures of interesting things I found. The Saquon made another series of vocalizations, then pointed toward the cave entrance, then to Alex, then made a shooing motion. The meaning was clear enough. It's letting you go, I translated. Now that I'm here to, I don't know, vouch for you? Explain? Why didn't it just let me go before? Alex demanded, still pressed against the wall. I thought about the helicopter sounds we'd heard, the specialists swarming the wilderness area, because there are people searching who know about these creatures, people who might want to capture them, study them. It was hiding you until it could safely release you. The Saquon nodded again, that disconcertingly human gesture, and pointed at the camera, then made a braking motion with its hands. It wants the photographs destroyed, I said. All evidence. Alex nodded frantically. Fine, whatever it wants. Just let me out of here. The creature stepped back from the entrance, clearing our path. I helped Alex to his feet, He was weak from his ordeal but able to walk. As we moved toward the exit, the Sequan caught my arm with a gentle but irresistible grip. It looked directly into my eyes, then pointed to the stone marker symbol traced in the dirt of the cave floor, then to itself, then made a gesture encompassing the entire forest. "I understand," I said. "This is your home, your territory. I'll make sure people respect that." It released me and made one final gesture, pointing to its eyes, then to mine, then making a circular motion that returned to the starting point. "Yes," I agreed, understanding its meaning with unexpected clarity. "I'll return someday." We left the cave, Alex leaning heavily on my shoulder. The Sequan did not follow but remained watching from the entrance, a silhouette against the darkness that seemed to embody the wilderness itself, ancient, powerful, and infinitely more complex than humanity had ever imagined. The journey back took nearly 5 hours, with Alex weakening as we progressed. I supported him as best I could, following game trails and landmarks to navigate back toward the ranger station. As we approached the edge of the developed area, I heard shouts and saw flashlight beams sweeping through the trees. The search parties were out in force. "We need a story," I told Alex quickly. "Something believable." He nodded, understanding immediately. "I got lost, fell, hit my head. You found me wandering, confused from a concussion. And the photos? The creature? Delirium," he said firmly. "Stress hallucinations. That's what I'll tell them." I squeezed his shoulder in gratitude. "Just one thing," I said as the searchlights drew nearer. "What did it feed you? In the cave?" Alex's expression shifted to something between wonder and confusion. "Berries," he said. "Fresh water. Once, a fish. It watched to see what I would eat, then brought more of the same." Before I could respond, the search team broke through the tree line ahead. Rivera, Roberts, and 2 of the specialists, armed with more than standard ranger equipment. "Matthews, thank God," Rivera shouted, rushing forward. "And is that... you found him? How?" "Questions later," I interrupted. "He needs medical attention. Exposure, dehydration, possible concussion." The specialists exchanged glances, one of them speaking quietly into a radio. Within minutes, a medical evacuation team arrived, loading Alex onto a stretcher despite his protests that he could walk. As they carried him toward the waiting vehicle, one of the specialists pulled me aside. "This conversation isn't over, Matthews," he said quietly. "We'll need a full debriefing. Everything you saw, everything you did." I met his gaze steadily. "Of course. But I think you already know what's out there." A flicker of something, recognition, respect, warning, crossed his face. "Then you understand the importance of discretion." "More than you might think," I replied. Later, after the medical team had taken Alex away and the search parties had dispersed, I stood alone on my cabin porch, looking out over the dark surface of Lake Wanasabi. The forest beyond seemed different now, not just wilderness to be managed, but territory to be respected, a realm where humanity was merely a recent visitor rather than the dominant force. I knew the specialist would return with their questions, their protocols, their containment strategies. I knew Alex would eventually tell his story of getting lost and suffering hallucinations from exposure and fear. I knew life would continue at Wanasabi Wilderness Area with its carefully marked trails and ranger-guided nature walks, but I also knew that, deep in the northern reaches, beyond the stone markers with their ancient carvings, something watched and waited. Something that had been here long before humans claimed the land. Something that would remain long after our brief moment in the forest's history had passed. And somehow, for reasons I might never fully understand, it had chosen me to witness its existence, to become a bridge between worlds, to carry the knowledge that we were not alone in the wild places of the earth. As if in response to my thoughts, a call echoed across the lake, that distinctive, otherworldly howl I had heard before, but now recognized not as a threat but as a declaration. A reminder of boundaries, of respect, of coexistence on nature's terms rather than humanity's. I raised my hand in acknowledgement, certain that somewhere in the darkness, amber eyes were watching, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would return to the stone marker when the time was right, to continue the conversation that had begun between ranger and legend, human and Sequan, in the ancient shadows of Wanasabi. I had always found solace in the wilderness. Something about disconnecting from civilization and testing my endurance against the raw elements restored my perspective. May 2023 marked 5 years since my divorce, and I needed space to reflect. The Olympic National Forest in Washington seemed the perfect retreat, dense, challenging, and far from the digital noise of my everyday life. My companions were 2 dogs, Jackson, a sturdy German Shepherd mix who had been with me for 7 years, and Penny, a small but spirited dachshund who had joined our pack more recently. They were experienced trail dogs, particularly Jackson, who had accompanied me on dozens of wilderness excursions. The trip was meticulously planned. I had mapped a 6-day route that would take us deep into the less traveled sections of the park, culminating in a high-elevation meadow I'd read about but never visited. My backpack contained lightweight camping gear, dehydrated meals, first aid supplies, and emergency equipment. In a side pocket, secured in a waterproof holster, was my .40 caliber handgun, a precaution I'd never needed but always carried in remote areas. The first 3 days unfolded exactly as planned. We hiked 8 to 10 miles daily, navigating dense forests and rocky outcroppings. The May weather was cooperative, cool mornings that warmed to comfortable hiking temperatures by midday, with only one brief afternoon shower. Wildlife sightings were normal: deer, marmots, and once, a black bear that quickly retreated upon noticing our presence. By the 4th day, we had traveled approximately 20 miles from the nearest access road. The terrain had become increasingly challenging, with steep ascents that tested my endurance and caused me to pause frequently to catch my breath. Jackson ranged ahead on the trail while Penny stayed closer, occasionally needing to be carried over difficult sections. "We're almost there," I told them as we climbed the final ridge, more for my benefit than theirs. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows through the thinning tree line. According to my GPS, our destination, a high meadow at approximately 7,000 feet elevation, lay just beyond the next rise. When we crested the ridge, the promised meadow spread before us, bathed in the golden light of approaching sunset. A natural clearing surrounded by stunted pines and bordered on one side by a steep, densely wooded hillside. A small stream trickled along the meadow's edge, providing a convenient water source. The isolation was complete, no human structures visible, no trails beyond the one we'd followed, no sounds but the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of birds preparing to roost. I felt a profound sense of achievement. This was why I undertook these journeys, to reach places that required effort, places where few people ventured. I removed my heavy pack, rolled my shoulders to relieve the pressure, and surveyed what would be our home for the night. Perfect timing, I murmured to myself as I checked my watch. 7:38 p.m. We had about an hour of usable daylight remaining, just enough time to establish camp and prepare for the night ahead. The process of setting up camp followed my usual efficient routine. I selected a flat area at the meadow's center, distant enough from the trees to avoid falling branches yet close enough to retreat to the forest edge if weather turned. My ultralight tent emerged from its compression sack, poles snapping into position with practiced movements. Jackson wandered the perimeter of the meadow, occasionally disappearing into the underbrush and reappearing moments later, his typical behavior when exploring new territory. Penny stayed closer, nosing around the immediate area of our campsite, tracking whatever small creatures had recently passed. While securing the tent stakes, I remembered the small notebook I always carried to document these trips. I paused to record our location, the date, May 18, 2023, and a brief description of the site. As I wrote, I noted that Jackson's behavior had changed. Rather than his methodical exploration, he had positioned himself at the edge of the meadow closest to the steep, wooded hillside. His posture was alert, tail raised, ears forward. Initially, I dismissed it. Jackson was sensitive to wildlife: deer, rabbits, the occasional marmot. This stance usually indicated curiosity rather than alarm. I continued preparing camp, unrolling my sleeping bag inside the tent and organizing cooking equipment. When I glanced up again, Jackson remained in the same position, but now he was barking. Not his excited, playful bark, but something more restrained, almost hesitant. It registered as unusual enough to warrant investigation. Securing the remaining gear, I walked toward him. "What is it, boy?" He didn't acknowledge me, his attention fixed on the wooded hillside rising steeply beyond the meadow's edge. The trees there were predominantly pine and spruce, growing densely on ground that angled sharply upward. The underbrush was thick, limiting visibility beyond the first few yards of forest. As I approached, I recalled a detail from the previous day's hike that had seemed insignificant at the time. At a trail junction marked by a stack of stones, a common wilderness waymarker, I had noticed a small piece of paper partially tucked beneath one of the rocks. Most hikers would recognize this as the wilderness equivalent of a community bulletin board, where important information might be shared with those who followed. The note had been written in pencil on what appeared to be a torn corner of a topographic map. It read, "Problem bear in high meadow area. Harassed campers 515. Exercise caution." It wasn't signed, nor did it specify exactly which meadow, but the date indicated it was recent. Furthermore, earlier that day, I had crossed an area of soft earth where clear tracks were visible, the distinctive round prints with pad marks and no claw impressions characteristic of a mountain lion. They weren't fresh, perhaps a day or two old, but they confirmed the presence of a predator in the vicinity. These recollections intensified my concern about Jackson's behavior. Wild predators typically avoided humans, but exceptions existed. Bears habituated to human food, mountain lions driven by unusual circumstances to consider humans as potential prey. Both scenarios were rare but known to occur. "Jackson, come," I commanded, wanting him closer as I assessed the situation. He obeyed reluctantly, moving to my side but maintaining his vigilant stare toward the hillside. His low whine expressed an anxiety I rarely witnessed in him. I scanned the forested slope carefully but detected no movement, no unusual sounds beyond the normal evening forest ambience. Still, Jackson's behavior demanded respect. Animals often perceive threats before humans do, their senses attuned to subtleties we miss. The sunlight was fading rapidly now, casting long shadows across the meadow. I needed to complete 2 essential tasks before darkness fell completely: securing our food supply against wildlife and collecting water for the night and morning. The food required hanging, standard procedure in bear country. A properly suspended food bag, at least 12 feet high and 6 feet from any tree trunk, was the most reliable non-firearm defense against curious bears. The problem was evident. The only trees suitable for hanging a bear bag were those on the hillside that had triggered Jackson's concern. "Stay," I instructed both dogs, retrieving my food supplies and a length of paracord from my pack. I would need to venture into the area that had provoked Jackson's reaction. Whatever wildlife might be present, I needed to secure our food, or risk a problematic nighttime encounter. I gathered my headlamp, knife, and bear spray. After brief hesitation, I also retrieved my handgun from its holster, securing it in my waistband. If I encountered a predator at close range on the steep terrain, the spray might be insufficient. With a deep breath to steady myself, I moved toward the hillside, aware that the approaching darkness made this task increasingly urgent. Jackson watched my departure with visible agitation, his whining intensifying as I approached the forest edge. The transition from open meadow to dense forest was abrupt. One moment I stood in the golden evening light, the next I moved through filtered shadows beneath a canopy of needled branches. The ground immediately began its sharp upward pitch, forcing me to lean forward and grab at tree trunks for balance. The slope was steeper than it had appeared from the meadow, 45 degrees or more in places, requiring careful foot placement to avoid slipping on the carpet of pine needles. I switched on my headlamp, though enough ambient light remained that the beam added little clarity. Behind me, Jackson had begun barking again, more insistently now. I glanced back and saw him at the forest edge, pacing anxiously but respecting my command to stay. Further back, Penny had positioned herself at the tent entrance, her smaller form barely visible in the diminishing light. "It's okay," I called back, more to reassure myself than the dogs. The rational part of my mind said this was routine. Just find a suitable tree, hang the food bag, return to camp. The primitive part registered warning signals: unfamiliar territory, approaching darkness, an anxious animal companion. I continued upward, moving from tree to tree, using each trunk as an anchor point, before ascending another few feet. After climbing approximately 100 feet up the slope, I identified a suitable arrangement, a sturdy horizontal branch extending from a mature pine, positioned such that a bag hung from it would meet all the criteria for bear safety. As I prepared to throw the cord over the branch, a sound froze me in place, the unmistakable rustling of movement in the underbrush, perhaps 50 feet further up the slope, not the light scurrying of a small animal, but something substantial enough to disturb multiple branches. Something large. Jackson's reaction was immediate and dramatic. His barking transformed from anxious alerting to aggressive defense, deep threatening sounds interspersed with snarls. I had heard this vocalization only once before, when a trespasser had attempted to enter my backyard at night. The adrenaline surge was immediate and overwhelming. My heart rate doubled in seconds, pounding so forcefully I could feel it in my throat. My breathing became shallow and rapid as primitive survival mechanisms engaged. Tunnel vision set in, my awareness constricting to the direction of the sound, the position of my dog, and the precarious nature of my footing on the steep slope. Logical analysis flashed through my mind in fragments. If this was the problem bear mentioned in the note, Jackson would likely charge if it approached, a confrontation he couldn't survive. If I needed to descend quickly, the steep slope presented serious risk. A fall could mean tumbling onto the boulder field visible at the forest edge. My gear was divided between what I carried and what remained at the campsite, limiting my options. Penny's frantic barking had now joined Jackson's, creating a duet of canine alarm. She should have been secured in the tent, but apparently had managed to exit somehow. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, multiple threats converging: unknown wildlife, approaching darkness, separated from my camp, dogs at risk. I called to Jackson, my voice coming out higher and tighter than intended. "Jackson, come." To my relief, he responded, retreating to my position and pressing against my legs as I braced my back against a tree trunk. His body trembled with tension, but his presence provided both comfort and complication. I felt less isolated, but now had his safety to consider as well as my own. In my panic state, I had forgotten the most obvious resource available. My free hand flew to my forehead, accidentally striking harder than intended in my haste to activate the headlamp I was already wearing. The sharp pain briefly cleared my mental fog. Light flooded the slope before me, cutting through the gathering darkness. I directed the beam upward, slowly scanning the area where I had heard the movement. I expected to see the reflective eyeshine of an animal, the characteristic glow produced when light strikes the tapetum lucidum in a predator's eyes. Nothing reflected back. No eyes, no movement, just the static arrangement of trees, underbrush, and rocks. Yet I remained certain that something substantial had moved there moments before. Jackson's continued tension confirmed my perception. I remained frozen, unable to retreat due to the treacherous footing, unwilling to continue upward toward the unidentified threat. At this impasse, Jackson suddenly lunged forward, breaking away from me with a ferocity I had never witnessed. He charged about 15 feet up the slope, teeth bared, snarling aggressively, not pursuing but making a display of territorial defense. His movement triggered a response. Something shifted at the ridgeline where the forest met the evening sky, something that broke the natural contour of the horizon. I directed my light toward the movement, focusing the beam on a shape that didn't match the surrounding vegetation. What I saw caused a sensation beyond fear, a total cessation of thought, a moment where my cognitive functions simply stopped. Approximately 75 feet up the slope, partially concealed among the trees, crouched a human figure. Not a hiker, not a park ranger, not anyone with legitimate reason to be in this remote location at dusk. The figure wore what appeared to be improvised camouflage, not commercial hunting gear, but layers of tattered fabric that mimicked the forest colors, supplemented with attached branches and vegetation that broke up the human silhouette. Most disturbing was the face, visible beneath a hood-like covering, smeared with what appeared to be mud or ash in irregular patterns that disrupted normal facial features. I couldn't distinguish eyes in the shadowed recesses of the face, but I felt with absolute certainty that our gazes had locked. There was awareness in that faceless stare, calculation and intent. Time dilated in that moment of recognition. Seconds stretched as we regarded each other across the distance. No words were exchanged, no movement occurred, just mutual awareness, predator and prey assessing one another. Except I couldn't determine which role I occupied in this encounter. My mind raced through possibilities, each more alarming than the last. A hunter illegally poaching in a national forest? A fugitive hiding from authorities? A disturbed individual who had retreated from society? None explained the elaborate camouflage, the deliberate concealment, the silent observation of my campsite. Penny's frantic barking at the campsite broke the paralysis that had gripped me. The practical concerns reasserted themselves. Darkness was nearly complete. I stood on dangerous terrain and I needed to return to my campsite immediately. With deliberate movements, I began backing down the slope, maintaining visual contact with the figure while negotiating the treacherous footing. Jackson reluctantly retreated with me, continuing to growl but responding to my quiet command to heel. Each time I moved between trees, using them as anchors on the steep descent, I paused to scan the area where I had seen the figure. I wanted to establish clearly that I had detected their presence, that any element of surprise had been lost. Sometimes I glimpsed movement, other times the figure seemed to have vanished, only to reappear slightly relocated when I adjusted my position. The descent required intense concentration. One misplaced foot could send me tumbling down the remaining slope onto the rocks below. Each step was a careful negotiation between speed and safety, urgency and precision. When I finally reached the bottom of the slope, the boulder field that marked the transition between forest and meadow, my legs were trembling from both exertion and continued adrenaline. I took a moment to scan the hillside one final time, confirming that the figure remained visible, still watching, still motionless except for minimal repositioning. I turned toward my campsite, expecting to see Penny still barking at the tent entrance. Instead, I found her circling the area, tail extended rigidly, a posture indicating high alertation rather than fear. She no longer barked but emitted a continuous low growl. As I approached, the source of her distress became apparent. The tent door, which I had securely zipped closed before departing, now gaped open. The zipper pulls, which I distinctly remembered positioning at the top of the tent door to prevent exactly this kind of canine escape, were now at the bottom of the opening. The implications were immediate and chilling. Either Penny possessed dexterity and intelligence far beyond what she had previously demonstrated, or someone had opened the tent during my brief absence on the hillside. Given the figure I had just encountered, The latter seemed far more probable. The thought that someone had approached my campsite while I was distracted, perhaps even entered my tent, triggered a new wave of panic. Had there been two people? Had the movement on the hillside been a deliberate distraction? Anger briefly overwhelmed fear, the violation of my space, the endangerment of my dogs, the psychological torment of being observed and manipulated. Acting on this surge of emotion, I retrieved my handgun, aimed skyward away from the hillside, and fired a single shot. The report echoed across the meadow, reverberating off the surrounding terrain. It was a primitive communication. I am armed. I am aware. I will defend myself. In the moment after the gunshot, silence descended. Even the natural forest sounds, the insects, the distant birds, the rustling leaves, seemed temporarily suspended. Into this vacuum, I spoke aloud to no one and everyone. I see you. Leave us alone. The remaining daylight disappeared rapidly after that confrontation. I stood motionless beside my tent, scanning the perimeter of the meadow, paying particular attention to the hillside where I had seen the figure. Nothing moved except the gentle swaying of branches in the evening breeze. The food bag remained in my possession, the bear hanging procedure abandoned in the face of more immediate concerns. This created a new problem: unsecured food in an area known to have bear activity. Under normal circumstances, this would be unacceptable, potentially dangerous. But these circumstances had transcended normal risk assessment. I made a rapid decision. Rather than remaining in the vulnerable tent as planned, I would create a more defensible position. Working quickly in the fading light, I relocated my sleeping bag and essential gear to a position between two large boulders at the meadow's edge. The natural stone formation created a partial enclosure with only one open side to monitor. Jackson and Penny stayed close as I worked, both unusually subdued. Jackson continued to watch the forest edge, particularly the hillside, but his aggressive barking had ceased. He seemed to have shifted from alarm to vigilance, understanding that quiet observation now served better than noisy confrontation. I placed the food bag, securely closed and sealed in an odor-proof container, several yards from our position, hoping that if it did attract wildlife, the activity would serve as an early warning system. My handgun remained within immediate reach, the holster unbuckled for quick access. As full darkness enveloped the meadow, I switched off my headlamp, better to preserve my night vision and avoid providing an illuminated target. The night was clear, with a waxing gibbous moon providing sufficient light to distinguish shapes and movement across the open terrain. Though the forest edges remained impenetrably dark, I leaned back against the cool stone. Dogs pressed against me for warmth and reassurance. The temperature dropped rapidly at this elevation, and I pulled a thermal blanket around all three of us. The familiar weight and warmth of the animals provided some comfort, but sleep was impossible. Every rustle of leaves, every subtle shift in the nocturnal sounds registered as a potential threat. My mind struggled to process the encounter. Who would be in this remote location? Camouflaged and observing. What were their intentions? The possibilities ranged from merely unsettling to genuinely sinister. A socially awkward nature enthusiast with poor boundaries who meant no harm but behaved inappropriately. A survivalist practicing extreme isolation techniques who resented intrusion into their territory. Someone with predatory intent who targeted isolated hikers. The last possibility was most disturbing but couldn't be dismissed. The figure had been watching before I noticed. How long, I couldn't determine. They had likely observed me setting up camp, noted my routines, perhaps even tracked me on previous days of hiking. The open tent suggested not just observation but active interference when opportunity arose. Hours passed in this hyper-vigilant state. Occasionally I dozed briefly, jolting awake at any change in the dog's posture or breathing. Around what I estimated to be midnight, Jackson suddenly stiffened, his attention fixed on the forest edge. I followed his gaze but detected nothing unusual. Minutes later, a sound reached us. Branches breaking, perhaps 200 yards into the forest, followed by what might have been a voice, too distant to distinguish words. I reached for the gun, aiming toward the sounds, but nothing emerged from the darkness. The remainder of the night passed in this tense cycle, momentary sounds or movements triggering heightened alertness, followed by extended periods of straining to detect anything unusual in the darkness. By the time pre-dawn light began to illuminate the eastern sky, exhaustion had settled deep in my body. As visibility improved, I conducted a careful survey of the meadow and visible forest edges. Nothing appeared disturbed. The tent remained as I had left it. The food container sat undisturbed where I had placed it. Despite the apparent normality, a decision had formed during the sleepless night. We would depart immediately. The planned exploration of the high country would be abandoned. Safety required returning to populated areas as quickly as possible. First light found me already packing. The usual methodical organization of gear was replaced by hasty stuffing of equipment into my backpack. Only essential items were retrieved from the tent. The rest was abandoned. Weight and speed were now the primary considerations. The tent itself I decided to leave behind. Returning to it, even briefly, felt unsafe, and its absence from my pack would lighten my load considerably. The sleeping bag, cooking equipment, and food supply were the priorities. Everything else was expendable. Jackson and Penny sensed the urgency, remaining close rather than exploring as they typically would during morning camp activities. I distributed food for them, more than their usual portion to sustain energy for the long hike ahead, and replenished their collapsible water bowls while I consulted my topographic map. The return journey presented challenges. The trail we had ascended covered approximately 20 miles from the nearest access road, normally a 2-day hike under optimal conditions. Given our current situation, traveling after dark seemed unwise, suggesting at least one night would need to be spent on the trail. An alternative route existed, following a different descent path that intersected with a more heavily traveled trail after about 16 miles. This would lead to a campground that, according to my information, sometimes hosted other hikers even in the off-season. The prospect of encountering others provided some comfort, though reaching this destination would require sustained, rapid hiking throughout the day. Decision made. I completed final preparations. Water bottles filled from the stream, map secured in its waterproof case, handgun loaded and holstered within easy reach. With a last glance at the abandoned tent, a bright manufactured object incongruous against the natural landscape, I shouldered my pack and directed the dogs toward the trail. The first hours of hiking passed in tense silence. The downhill trajectory assisted our pace, but required careful footing to avoid injury. I maintained constant awareness of our surroundings, frequently pausing to listen and observe, particularly the path behind us. Jackson adopted a new pattern, ranging behind rather than ahead, frequently stopping to look and listen in the direction we had come. By midday we had covered approximately 8 miles. The physical exertion had partially displaced the previous night's fear with the more immediate sensations of muscle fatigue and hunger. We paused briefly beside a small cascade where the trail crossed a stream. I distributed trail mix for myself and additional food for the dogs, then refilled our water supplies. During this rest I conducted another careful survey of our surroundings. The forest here was typical Pacific Northwest old growth, towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks creating a high canopy, with understory vegetation of ferns and berry bushes. Visibility extended perhaps 30 yards in most directions before the tree trunks created an effective visual barrier. Nothing appeared unusual, yet I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. Jackson, too, remained unusually alert, his rest punctuated by frequent raising of his head to scan our back trail. Penny, less perceptive or perhaps simply more exhausted, had curled up on my pack and appeared to be genuinely resting. The remainder of the day's hiking continued this pattern, steady progress interrupted by frequent checks of our surroundings and the trail behind us. By late afternoon, fatigue had become a significant factor. My pace had slowed despite best efforts, and even Jackson showed signs of exhaustion, tongue lolling, steps less precise. Penny had been carried in my arms for the past hour, adding to my burden. According to my map and GPS, we had covered approximately 14 miles, an impressive distance given the terrain, but short of the 16 required to reach the more popular trail junction and potential camping companions. As sunlight began to fade between the trees, I faced another difficult decision: continue hiking in diminishing light with exhausted bodies, or establish camp in a location I had not planned for and face another night of potential vulnerability. The decision was effectively made for me when we rounded a bend in the trail and I spotted a small clearing approximately 50 yards ahead, adjacent to the trail. More significantly, I glimpsed what appeared to be the orange glow of a campfire and the outlines of tents. Other hikers. Relief flooded through me. Even if they were strangers, their presence represented safety in numbers. I quickened my pace despite protesting muscles, eager to reach this unexpected sanctuary. As we approached the clearing, I called out, standard wilderness etiquette to avoid startling other campers. "Hello, the camp. Hiker coming in." The response was immediate and welcoming. "Hey there, come on in." The campsite contained 2 tents and a properly constructed fire ring where 3 people, 2 men and a woman in their 30s or early 40s, sat on portable camp chairs. Standard backpacking equipment was neatly arranged around the site. Nothing about the scene suggested anything other than experienced outdoor enthusiasts enjoying a wilderness trip. "Rough day?" one of the men asked as I entered the clearing, noting my disheveled appearance and the dog's obvious exhaustion. "You could say that," I replied, dropping my pack with a heaviness that communicated more than words. The hikers introduced themselves as William, Gregory, and Joanna, a trio of friends from Portland who made annual pilgrimages to different sections of the Olympic Range. They had established camp several hours earlier and were planning a layover day tomorrow to explore surrounding areas before continuing their journey. They graciously invited me to share their fire and campsite. I established my minimal camp some distance from theirs, close enough for conversation but maintaining space for the dogs to settle. Jackson collapsed immediately upon release from trail duty, sprawling near my sleeping bag with uncharacteristic disregard for his surroundings. Penny curled against him, equally depleted. As I prepared a simple meal from my provisions, William approached with a steaming cup. "Thought you might want some actual coffee instead of that instant stuff," he offered, extending the cup. "You look like you've had a rough time." The simple kindness nearly undid my composure. I accepted with murmured thanks, the aromatic steam a reminder of civilized comforts that had seemed distant during the previous night's vigil. "Long day's hike?" he inquired, settling onto a fallen log nearby. "That, and a bad night before," I replied, sipping the coffee. The warmth spread through my chest, thawing something frozen inside. "I'm coming down from the high meadow camp." William's expression shifted subtly. "Up by Alpine Ridge? The one that sits about 7,000 feet?" I nodded, noting his reaction. "You know it. We were planning to head up there day after tomorrow," he said, glancing back toward his companions. "Any reason we shouldn't?" The question opened a floodgate. Words poured out as I described the previous day's events, the dog's unusual behavior, the figure on the hillside, the open tent, the night spent watching and listening. I described the camouflaged figure in detail, emphasizing the deliberate nature of the observation and the unsettling implications. As I spoke, Gregory and Joanna drifted over, drawn by the intensity in my voice. Their reactions progressed from initial skepticism to growing concern as the details accumulated. "You're certain it was a person?" Gregory asked. "Not a misidentified animal or shadow?" "Absolutely certain," I replied. We made eye contact. He, I'm assuming male based on size and build, was wearing some kind of homemade ghillie suit. The face was covered in mud or ash and patterns, deliberate camouflage. "And the tent was definitely opened while you were away?" Joanna asked. "Without question. I specifically remember placing the zipper pulls at the top of the door. When I returned, they were at the bottom. Penny couldn't have done that herself." A silence fell over the group as they processed the information. William finally broke it. His voice lowered, though there was no one else to overhear. "We've been hiking this region for years," he said. "There are stories, things people have reported but that never make official records. Hikers feeling watched, equipment moved or tampered with. A few actual sightings, similar to what you described." Gregory nodded. "Rangers tend to dismiss these reports. No evidence, no official investigation. But the stories persist." "Have you heard anything specific about the high meadow?" I asked. William and Gregory exchanged glances. Joanna answered. 2 years ago, a solo hiker was found dead at the base of that same ridge," she said. "The official report listed it as an accidental fall. He was an experienced outdoorsman in good physical condition. People who knew him questioned whether he would have made the kind of mistake that led to that fall." "And last year," Gregory added, "a woman disappeared in the same general area. Her body was found 3 weeks later. The cause of death was officially ruled as homicide, blunt force trauma to the head. No suspects were ever identified." The information confirmed my worst fears while simultaneously validating my decision to flee the area. What I had encountered wasn't an isolated incident or misinterpreted natural phenomenon. It represented a genuine threat that had already claimed lives. "We're obviously changing our plans," William said, gesturing toward his companions. "First light tomorrow, we're heading back to the trailhead with you." The decision was unanimous and unquestioned. Whatever their original hiking objectives had been, they were now secondary to safety concerns. The 4 of us would travel together, returning to civilization by the most direct route possible. As darkness settled over the campsite, we established a watch rotation. Despite the relative safety of numbers, none of us felt comfortable sleeping unguarded. I took the first shift, sitting beside the dying embers of the fire with Jackson at my feet, watching the perimeter of our small clearing fade into the surrounding darkness. For the first time since the encounter, surrounded by capable companions and with a clear plan for returning to safety, I allowed exhaustion to surface. When my watch ended and Gregory took over, I settled into my sleeping bag and fell immediately into dreamless sleep. The return journey with William, Gregory, and Joanna was uneventful. We maintained a brisk pace, reached the trailhead by mid-afternoon of the following day, and parted with exchanges of contact information and promises to share any relevant information about the incident. Their presence had transformed what might have been a continued ordeal into something manageable, a concerning experience to be processed rather than an immediate threat to survive. The drive home provided time for reflection. The initial shock and fear had subsided, replaced by a more analytical consideration of what had occurred. The encounter itself was disturbing but ultimately ambiguous. Observation without direct threat, proximity without contact. What elevated it beyond mere unpleasantness was the context provided by William and Joanna, the history of suspicious incidents in the same location, the documented fatalities that might be connected. Upon returning home, I immediately reported the incident to the National Park Service. The ranger who took my statement was professional but noticeably reserved when I described the camouflaged figure. He asked appropriate questions about the location, timing, and details of what I had observed, but his demeanor suggested skepticism about my interpretation of events. "We'll certainly look into this," he assured me, in a tone that implied the opposite. It might have been another hiker testing wilderness survival techniques. There are groups that practice primitive skills in the national forests. At dusk, in a remote location, wearing improvised camouflage and watching a stranger's campsite, I countered. "And potentially entering my tent while I was absent?" He shrugged slightly. "Without evidence, it's difficult to pursue, but we appreciate the report and will add it to our awareness of the area." The dismissive response was frustrating but not surprising. Without physical evidence or corroborating witnesses, my experience remained anecdotal, serious to me but insubstantial to official channels. Unwilling to let the matter rest, I turned to alternative sources of information. Online forums for Pacific Northwest hikers yielded scattered reports with unsettling similarities to my experience. A post from 3 years earlier described a solo hiker's sense of being watched throughout a 2-day trip in the same region, culminating in finding boot prints around his tent that didn't match his own footwear. Another account detailed a couple's decision to abandon their campsite after observing a person in unusual clothing watching from the trees, who disappeared when approached. Most disturbing was a report from approximately 4 years earlier, in which a hiker described finding an improvised shelter deep in the Olympic wilderness, containing collected items apparently taken from other hikers, water bottles of different brands, various equipment pieces, even personal items like a journal and photographs. None of these accounts had resulted in official investigation or confirmation. Like my own experience, they existed in a gray area, not definitively supernatural or paranormal, but outside the parameters of normal wilderness encounters. The most substantive information came from newspaper archives. The incidents Gregory and Joanna had mentioned were documented in local publications. 2 years earlier, Russell Weber, 42, an experienced mountaineer, had indeed been found dead at the base of a cliff approximately half a mile from the meadow where I had camped. The coroner had ruled the death accidental, resulting from a fall of approximately 30 feet onto rocky terrain. More recently, Valerie Hernandez, 37, had disappeared during a solo photography expedition in the same region. Her remains were discovered 3 weeks later, in a ravine several miles from her last known location. The cause of death was confirmed as blunt force trauma to the skull. The case remained open but inactive, with no identified suspects. These confirmed cases transformed my perspective on the encounter. What might have been dismissed as an unsettling but ultimately harmless interaction now carried more sinister implications. The figure I had observed might be connected to actual harm that had come to others in the same wilderness area. I forwarded my compiled research to William, Gregory, and Joanna, who responded with additional information they had gathered through their own connections in the hiking community. A pattern emerged of unreported or minimally investigated incidents spanning at least 5 years, all within a roughly 20-mile radius that included the high meadow where I had camped. Joanna, who worked as a data analyst, created a visualization mapping these incidents against terrain features. The resulting pattern suggested a central area of activity with radiating paths along major trails, consistent with someone operating from a fixed location but monitoring a larger territory. Armed with this more comprehensive documentation, I made a second report, this time to the County Sheriff's Department, rather than the Park Service. The detective who received the information displayed greater interest, particularly in the compiled pattern of incidents. "We can't allocate resources based solely on reported feelings of being watched," he explained, "but the clustering of confirmed incidents combined with multiple similar reports does warrant attention. I'll coordinate with the Park Service to increase patrols in the identified areas during the upcoming season." It wasn't a full investigation, but it represented acknowledgement, official recognition that something beyond normal wilderness hazards might be present in that remote section of forest. In the months since that encounter, I've continued hiking but with modified practices. I no longer travel solo in remote areas. My routes are shared in advance with multiple contacts, with scheduled check-ins. I carry enhanced communication equipment, including a satellite messenger with emergency functions. Jackson and Penny still accompany me, though our adventures now typically involve more popular trails where the presence of other hikers is likely. Jackson occasionally still displays the alertness I witnessed that evening, staring intently into forests with raised hackles, but these moments are brief and might simply reflect normal canine awareness of wildlife. The meadow where I encountered the watching figure remains uninvestigated by officials. According to online trail reports, hikers occasionally camp there without incident. Perhaps what I experienced was isolated, a rare interaction with someone who normally remains undetected in the wilderness, or perhaps they've simply become more cautious about when and where they reveal themselves. I don't expect resolution or confirmation. Wilderness areas by definition exist beyond the boundaries of consistent human presence and oversight. They contain spaces where unusual circumstances can develop unobserved, where individuals can operate under principles and motivations that diverge from societal norms. This uncertainty is precisely what makes the experience continue to disturb me, not knowing whether what I encountered was merely unusual or actively malevolent, not knowing if the figure observed other hikers before or after me, not knowing if the deaths connected to that area were tragic accidents or deliberate acts. What remains certain is the sensation that lodged permanently in my awareness during those moments on the hillside. The visceral recognition that I was being watched by someone who did not wish to be seen, and the immediate understanding that this represented a fundamental violation of the wilderness contract. Nature might be indifferent to human presence, might present inherent dangers, but it does not observe with intent. Only another human brings that particular quality of attention. And sometimes, that attention harbors purpose beyond simple observation. I still dream of that faceless figure sometimes, half hidden among the trees as darkness gathered. In the dreams, unlike reality, I call out, ask why they watch, what they want. The figure never answers, but simply retreats further into the forest, always maintaining that same careful distance, close enough to observe, far enough to vanish if pursued. Perhaps that lingering uncertainty is the true nature of horror, not the confirmed presence of danger, but the persistent inability to determine whether danger exists, and if so, what form it might take. The forest holds many secrets. Some are simply waiting to be discovered. Others actively resist discovery, retreating deeper into shadow when approached. I no longer seek those secrets. The Olympic wilderness remains beautiful, worth experiencing, worth protecting. But now I move through it differently, with awareness that not all observers are benign, and not all watching eyes belong to the natural world. As a park ranger, I learned that when hikers report seeing a ranger who looks exactly like you patrolling areas where you've never been, it's time to request a transfer. The first report came on a Tuesday in late October. I was checking trail conditions at the visitor center in Elkhorn when Logan, one of our regular hikers, approached the desk with an odd expression. "Hey Sean, I thought you were out on Bray Road this morning," he said, setting down his thermos. "I haven't been on Bray Road in weeks," I replied, feeling the first whisper of unease crawl up my spine. Logan frowned. "That's weird. I could have sworn I saw you about 2 miles in, standing just off the trail. You were looking into the woods, didn't respond when I called out." I shrugged it off as a case of mistaken identity. Ranger uniforms look similar enough from a distance, but 2 days later, an elderly couple reported the same thing, then a photographer, then a family with 2 young children. All described seeing me in locations where I hadn't been, standing motionless, watching the forest. By the 3rd week, I'd submitted my transfer request. Walworth County had always felt off to me, even before these incidents. Growing up in southern Wisconsin, I'd heard all the stories about the Beast of Bray Road, a werewolf-like creature that had terrified locals since the late 1980s. I never believed those tales, attributing them to overactive imaginations and the strange way darkness transforms the rural landscape. My supervisor, Nathan, denied my request. "We're understaffed as it is, Sean. It's just hikers seeing things. These woods play tricks on people's minds." I didn't argue. Nathan was retiring in a month, and his replacement, Gavin, seemed more reasonable. I'd try again then. The November air turned bitter as I patrolled the northern section of the county park. Leaves crunched beneath my boots, the only sound in the otherwise silent forest. Wisconsin winters came early, and the dying light filtered weakly through bare branches. My radio crackled, Nathan's voice breaking through static. "Sean, I need you at the Delavan trailhead. We've got a situation." When I arrived, 3 squad cars from the sheriff's department were parked haphazardly, lights flashing. Nathan stood talking with Sheriff Kyle Mason while deputies combed the area. "What happened?" I asked. Nathan's face was grim. "Missing hiker, college student from Madison. His friends say he ventured off trail about 3 hours ago, following what he thought was a ranger." My blood ran cold. "Did they describe the ranger?" Sheriff Mason answered. "They said it looked exactly like you. which is impossible since you were conducting educational programs at the visitor center all afternoon. The search lasted until nightfall with no results. We found one of the students' gloves, a water bottle, and disturbing tracks that made no sense, some appearing human, others decidedly not. The footprints would start normally, then suddenly deepen as if the person's weight had doubled, before transforming into something with claws that disappeared into the underbrush. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside my cabin, branches scraping against the windows like desperate fingers seeking entry. I reviewed local folklore, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. The Beast of Bray Road sightings stretched back decades, with numerous encounters reported around Elkhorn, Delavan, and throughout Walworth County. Witnesses described a tall, fur-covered creature with wolf-like features that sometimes walked on two legs. Many reports mentioned glowing yellow eyes and an overwhelming stench like decaying meat, but nothing in the lore mentioned the creature mimicking humans or creating doppelgangers. At 3:17 a.m., my phone rang. It was Owen, another ranger who patrolled the southern section. "Sean, you need to come to the station now," he said, his voice shaking. "What's wrong?" "They found the missing student's camera. You need to see the photos." 20 minutes later, I stood in the small ranger station as Owen pulled up the images on a computer. The first few showed typical hiking scenes, friends posing on trails, landscape shots of the forest. Then came a series taken after the student had apparently separated from his group. The third photo from the end made my stomach lurch. It showed a figure in a ranger uniform standing about 50 yards away, back turned to the camera. The final photo was a close-up, as if the student had approached the figure. It had turned slightly, and though the face was mine, the eyes were solid black. The skin around them cracked like dry earth. "This doesn't make sense," I whispered. Owen nodded grimly. "There's more. A hiker reported something else today. She was on the trail near Spring Prairie when she saw a ranger, looking like you, standing by a massive tree. She said when the figure turned, its uniform rippled, like something was moving underneath." I spent the rest of the night reviewing historical records, searching for any similar incidents. In 1936, nuns at St. Coletta Convent in Racine reported seeing a groundskeeper in multiple places simultaneously before one of their own disappeared. In 1978, 3 hikers vanished near Baraboo, after reporting a park employee that wasn't right. Each incident occurred during years of increased Beast of Bray Road sightings. As dawn broke, I made a decision. If the department wouldn't let me transfer, I'd take matters into my own hands. Something was using my appearance to lure people into the forest, and I couldn't sit by while more disappeared. I packed my gear and headed toward Bray Road. If I wanted answers, I needed to find my doppelganger. Morning fog hung heavy over Bray Road as I parked my truck at the old fire service entrance. This section of forest was technically closed to the public. The trails here had been abandoned after severe storm damage 3 years ago, perfect for whatever was impersonating me. I checked my equipment: GPS, radio, first aid kit, flashlight, knife, bear spray, and my personal Glock 22. The service weapon wasn't standard issue for Wisconsin park rangers, but after 8 years in the department, I'd secured special permission. The weight of it against my hip provided little comfort as I ventured into the mist-shrouded trees. The forgotten trail was barely visible, nature reclaiming what humans had surrendered. I documented everything on my phone: unusual tracks, broken branches, anything that might indicate something large moving through the area. For 3 hours, I found nothing beyond typical forest signs: deer prints, raccoon scat, the occasional turkey feather. Around noon, I reached a small clearing where the rangers used to maintain a rest area. The wooden picnic table was rotting, split down the middle as if something heavy had crashed onto it. Nearby, a maple tree displayed unusual markings, deep gouges in the bark about 7 feet up the trunk, far higher than a bear would mark. As I photographed the claw marks, the radio on my belt crackled. I expected Nathan or Owen, but only static emerged, punctuated by what sounded like breathing. I switched channels, but the breathing continued, growing heavier. "This is Ranger Sean Winters. Identify yourself," I demanded. The breathing stopped abruptly. Then, through the static, I heard my own voice respond. "Ranger Winters. Assistance needed. Injured hiker. Raccoon Hollow." Raccoon Hollow was nearly 2 miles northeast, a small depression in the landscape known for its rocky outcroppings. The voice was mine, but the cadence was wrong, too measured, as if each word was being carefully selected. I knew better than to head directly there. Instead, I radioed the station. "Owen, has anyone reported an injured hiker today?" After a moment of silence, Owen responded. "Negative. All quiet today. Where are you?" "Just checking the old trails near Bray. Someone just used my voice on Channel 3 to report an injured hiker." "Sean, Channel 3 has been down for maintenance since yesterday. No one could broadcast on it. My skin prickled as I surveyed the clearing. Something was watching me. I could feel it. Owen, I need you to track my GPS position. If I don't check in every 30 minutes, send Sheriff Mason. What's going on, Sean? I'm going to find out what's using my identity. Against better judgment, I headed toward Raccoon Hollow, but circuitously, approaching from the western ridge where I'd have a clear view of the depression below. The fog had lifted, but dark clouds now threatened rain. Perfect horror movie weather, I thought grimly. From my vantage point, I scanned the hollow with binoculars. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just the familiar rock formations and a small seasonal stream nearly dry from lack of rain. Then movement caught my eye. A figure in a ranger uniform stood by the largest boulder. Even from this distance, I recognized myself. The same build, the same posture. The doppelganger was perfectly still, facing away from me, looking down at something I couldn't see. I documented everything with my phone camera, zooming in as much as possible. Through the lens, I noticed something disturbing. The uniform occasionally rippled along the back, as if something beneath it was shifting position. A crack of thunder broke my concentration. When I looked back, the figure was gone. I waited 10 minutes before descending into the hollow, approaching the boulder cautiously. The ground around it told a story I struggled to comprehend. Multiple footprints, identical to my boot treads, circled the area, some pressing so deeply into the mud they must have been made by something far heavier than a human. Behind the boulder, I found a backpack. The name tag identified it as belonging to the missing student. Inside was a journal, with entries detailing his fascination with the Beast of Bray Road legend. The final entry sent ice through my veins, following a ranger deeper into the woods. Something's off about him. His movements aren't quite right. When he turned toward me, just for a second I could swear his eyes were completely wrong. But I need to know what he wants to show me. Rain began to fall as I photographed the journal and packed it away as evidence. The storm intensified quickly, forcing me to seek shelter in a small rock overhang nearby. As water coursed down the hillside, something pale tumbled from the undergrowth above. A human femur, scraped clean. I radioed Owen immediately. I've found evidence of the missing student and what appears to be human remains. Sending coordinates. The response was my own voice again, distorted through static. Remain in place. Help coming. Thunder crashed directly overhead, and in the momentary illumination of lightning, I saw a figure standing in the rain just 20 yards away. My doppelganger, perfectly still despite the downpour, watching me. Another flash revealed it had moved closer, now only 15 yards away, without making a sound. Its face, my face, was expressionless, but the eyes were wrong. Not black as in the photo, but yellow with vertical pupils. I drew my Glock and shouted over the storm. Identify yourself. The thing tilted its head at an impossible angle, nearly 90 degrees. Its mouth opened too wide, revealing teeth that no human should possess. When it spoke, it used my voice, but broken into disjointed fragments. Sean. Winters. Help. Coming. Stay. Forest. I fired a warning shot into the air. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it smiled. A terrible parody of my own smile stretched too far across its face. Lightning struck a nearby tree, temporarily blinding me. When my vision cleared, the thing was gone, but a new sound rose above the storm. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from all directions at once. I retreated deeper under the overhang, weapon ready, rain soaking through my uniform. Night was still hours away, but the storm had turned the forest prematurely dark. My phone showed no signal, and the radio emitted only static, interspersed with my own distorted voice repeating fragments of previous transmissions. I was alone with whatever stalked these woods. Something that could wear my face and speak with my voice. Something connected to the legendary Beast of Bray Road, but far more cunning than any creature in the stories. As I waited for the storm to pass, I realized a terrible truth. I wasn't hunting it. It was hunting me. Chapter 3. Echoes in the dark. The storm persisted into evening, transforming the forest into a treacherous maze of mud and flooded depressions. I abandoned the rock overhang when water began seeping in, forced to navigate through the downpour toward higher ground. My uniform clung to my skin, each step a battle against the saturated earth trying to claim my boots. With darkness approaching and my radio useless, I had two options: attempt to reach my vehicle in failing light, or find secure shelter until morning. The nearest ranger cabin was on the eastern perimeter, roughly 3 miles through increasingly hazardous terrain. My truck was about the same distance in the opposite direction. I chose the cabin. Better to have solid walls between me and whatever wore my face. The forest had transformed in the storm. Familiar landmarks were obscured by rain and shadow, forcing me to rely on my GPS. Twice I heard movement paralleling my path, something large keeping pace through the underbrush. Each time I turned my flashlight toward the sound, I caught only glimpses of retreating shadows. An hour into my trek, I found fresh tracks crossing my path. Ranger boots identical to mine, but the gait was wrong. The stride length varied impossibly, sometimes 8 feet between prints, as if the creature had briefly bounded on all fours before resuming its human mimicry. The tracks led toward the eastern perimeter, exactly where I was headed. At 8:42 p.m., my flashlight caught something ahead that stopped me cold. A ranger hat, my spare from the truck, hung on a branch directly in my path, perfectly positioned at eye level. Beneath it was a small canvas bag. I approached cautiously, weapon drawn. The bag contained a Park Service radio, an older model we'd phased out years ago, and a Polaroid photograph showing Nathan, Owen, and me at last year's department picnic. Our faces were scratched out, replaced with crude yellow eyes drawn in what looked like dried blood. The radio suddenly activated, emitting a series of clicks followed by a guttural sound between a growl and speech. I nearly dropped it when my voice emerged from the speaker. Sean. Home. Waiting. The implications chilled me more than the rain. The creature knew where I was going. It was hurting me. I changed course immediately, veering north toward Jefferson County. There was an old hunting cabin owned by Jason, a fellow ranger who'd let me use it during deer season. It wasn't on any official maps, a potential sanctuary if I could reach it. The forest grew denser as I navigated by memory, and the occasional landmark visible in my failing flashlight. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the damage was done. Twice I nearly lost my footing on slick embankments, the second time sliding halfway down a ravine before catching myself on an exposed root. As I climbed back up, my light caught movement at the ravine's edge. The doppelganger stood watching me, its borrowed face now showing signs of transformation. The skin around its jaw had split, revealing dark fur and elongated teeth. Its eyes gleamed yellow in the flashlight beam. I raised my weapon, but it made no move to attack. Instead, it cocked its head as if studying me. "What are you?" I demanded. The thing's mouth moved unnaturally, struggling to form words with a jaw that was shifting between human and animal. "We are guardian, forest, protector. You've been taking people." It nodded slowly. "Trespassers, desecrators." It gestured vaguely eastward. "They build, they cut, they poison. We preserve." A twig snapped in the darkness beyond my light's reach. Then another. The creature smiled with too many teeth. "Family, coming." I fired twice at the doppelganger. It moved with impossible speed, disappearing into the shadows as more sounds emerged from the forest around me, multiple entities converging on my position. I ran. The next hour became a desperate flight through waterlogged terrain. I abandoned stealth for speed, crashing through underbrush, splashing across swollen streams. Behind me, shadows moved between trees, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4. Yellow eyes flashed in my peripheral vision, always keeping pace but never closing the distance, as if the pursuit itself was the point. I reached the hunting cabin near midnight, lungs burning, legs trembling with exhaustion. The small structure was dark and silent, its metal roof pinging softly with residual raindrops. I approached from the rear, circling to ensure nothing waited in the immediate vicinity. The door was locked, but Jason always kept a key hidden in a fake rock near the woodpile. My hands shook as I retrieved it, constantly scanning the tree line where shapes seemed to shift in the darkness. Inside, I secured every window and door before allowing myself to breathe. The cabin was a single room with basic amenities, a wood stove, small kitchenette, cot, and, thank God, a shotgun mounted on the wall. I checked the breech, loaded, as Jason always kept it. I stripped off my soaked uniform and hung it by the stove, which I lit with shaking hands. As warmth gradually filled the space, I inventoried my situation. 2 weapons, limited ammunition, no working communications, and unknown numbers of creatures that could seemingly transform between human and beast lurking outside. The legends of the Beast of Bray Road had never mentioned shapeshifting or mimicry. What I faced was something folklore had failed to capture, something intelligent and organized. Around 1 a.m., I heard something on the roof. Careful, deliberate movement tracking back and forth, then scratching at the windows, subtle at first, growing more insistent. I positioned myself in the corner with the clearest sight lines to all entry points, both weapons within reach. A voice called from outside. Nathan's this time, not mine. "Sean? You in there? We've been searching for you since you missed your check-in." I remained silent. Nathan wouldn't be out here alone in the middle of the night. "Sean, it's not safe out here. There's been another disappearance. We need to regroup." When I didn't respond, the voice changed, becoming Owen's, then shifting to a perfect imitation of Sheriff Mason. "Ranger Winters, this is an order. Open the door." The deception confirmed what I'd suspected. These creatures could mimic anyone they'd observed. I wondered how long they'd been watching us, learning our mannerisms, our voices, our patterns. Something heavy landed on the porch. The door handle turned slowly, testing my lock. When it held, a low growl of frustration vibrated through the walls. Then came a new sound, a rhythmic thumping from multiple directions. I realized with horror they were testing the cabin's structural integrity, searching for weaknesses. They found one at 2:17 a.m. The small bathroom window, reinforced but still vulnerable, shattered inward as a massive clawed hand reached through. I fired the shotgun without hesitation. A howl of pain echoed as the appendage withdrew, taking pieces of the window frame with it. I used the moment to barricade the bathroom door with the refrigerator, but the assault had just begun. For the next hour, they tested every possible entry point while voices called to me using familiar tones. Colleagues, friends, even my mother's voice pleading for help. The psychological warfare was effective. Exhaustion and adrenaline created a dangerous cocktail that made focusing difficult. I found myself nodding off despite the danger, jerking awake at every new sound. Dawn was still hours away when the attacks suddenly ceased. The forest fell silent save for the normal sounds of wildlife returning. Had they given up? I doubted it. I used the respite to check the window they'd attacked. Blood, dark and viscous, with an odd silvery quality, coated the broken glass and dripped down the wall. I collected a sample in an empty water bottle, determined to have it analyzed if I survived. As false dawn lightened the eastern sky, I caught movement through the front window. A figure stood at the forest's edge, not my doppelganger this time, but a ranger I didn't recognize. It waved once, then turned and walked into the trees. Minutes later, my phone chirped. Service restored. 3 missed calls from Owen and a text. Where are you? Nathan missing since yesterday. Search teams mobilized. I had a signal. I could call for help. But something felt wrong about the timing. Outside, something howled, a sound between wolf and human that raised every hair on my body. It was answered by similar calls from multiple directions. They were coming back. And this time, they were coming together. First light revealed what the creatures had done while I barricaded myself inside the cabin. Arranged in a perfect circle around the structure were 11 park ranger hats, each positioned on a stake driven into the ground. At the center of the clearing stood a crude effigy made from twisted branches and clothing scraps, a human-shaped figure wearing a tattered ranger uniform. I photographed everything from the windows, documenting the macabre display while maintaining the cabin's security. My phone showed 1 bar of service, enough to send images to Owen with a text. Trapped at Jason's hunting cabin. Unknown hostiles. Send armed backup, not rangers. Verify identities. A message sent, but Owen's reply came back garbled. Most words replaced with random characters. Only fragments were legible. Nathan found. Medical, not human. Stay, coming. I tried calling the sheriff's department directly. The call connected, but contained only static and what sounded like distant howling. Something was interfering with communications. The same entities that could mimic human voices seemed capable of disrupting technology when it suited them. I was effectively isolated again. I used the daylight to better fortify the cabin, moving furniture against vulnerable points and fashioning makeshift weapons from kitchen implements. The shotgun had 5 shells remaining, and my Glock held 11 rounds plus 1 chambered, limited ammunition against unknown numbers. By mid-morning, the forest had come alive with normal sounds, birds calling, squirrels chattering. The deceptive normalcy was broken only by occasional glimpses of movement just beyond clear sight. A ranger uniform disappearing behind distant trees, a flash of yellow eyes watching from deep shadow. They were containing me, not attacking. Waiting for something. I reviewed what I knew, sketching a timeline of events in a small notebook Jason kept by the wood stove. The doppelganger sightings had begun 3 weeks ago. The first disappearance occurred 5 days later. Historical records showed similar patterns, stretching back decades, always in cycles. Activity for several months, followed by years of dormancy. What had triggered this cycle? What had changed in the forest? The answer came when I found a faded newspaper clipping tucked inside Jason's local wildlife guidebook. 6 months ago, the county had approved development plans for the eastern section of the protected forest, a minimally invasive resort complex that would claim nearly 200 acres of old-growth woodland. They build. They cut. They poison. We preserve. The creature's words made terrible sense now. These entities, whatever they were, saw themselves as forest guardians. The development threatened their territory, and they had responded by infiltrating the human power structure responsible for forest management, the ranger service. By noon, the temperature had climbed uncomfortably, the cabin becoming stifling despite the broken bathroom window. I rationed water from Jason's emergency supply, fighting exhaustion after a sleepless night. I needed to maintain vigilance, but my body demanded rest. I compromised by positioning myself in the corner with the clearest view of all entry points, propping my back against the wall with the shotgun across my lap. I would allow myself 10 minutes of closed eyes, no more. I woke to the sound of a vehicle approaching. The sun had shifted position. I'd been asleep for at least 2 hours. Cursing myself, I moved carefully to the window. A ranger service truck was parking in the clearing, its familiar green and white paint job partially obscured by mud. Sheriff Mason stepped out, followed by 2 deputies I recognized, Ian and Ethan. All 3 were armed with service weapons and wore tactical vests. They moved with professional caution, scanning the tree line as they approached the cabin. "Sean Winters," Mason called. "We've got the place surrounded. Come out slowly with your hands visible." I watched them carefully. Their movements seemed natural, their uniforms properly worn. But after what I'd seen, I couldn't trust appearances. "Identify yourselves," I shouted through the door. Mason looked confused. "It's Sheriff Mason, Sean. You know me." "Prove it," he sighed. 2 years ago, you helped my son with a science project on forest ecosystems. He got an A, and I bought you a beer at Elkhorn Tavern. There were peanut shells all over the floor, and you kept complaining about how they stuck to your boots. It was a genuine memory, specific enough that it seemed unlikely a mimic could know it. But I remained cautious. "Why are you looking for me?" "Nathan turned up this morning wandering along Highway 12. He's in the hospital. Severe dehydration, exposure, trauma. He was raving about creatures in the forest. Then we got your message." Mason stepped closer. "Sean, what's happening out here?" I weighed my options. If they were legitimate, I needed their help. If they were mimics, I was already trapped. "I'm coming out," I said. "But I'm armed, and I'm keeping my weapon ready." I unlocked the door, pushing it open with my foot while maintaining distance. Glock positioned at my side but accessible. The 3 men remained where they were, hands visible. "We need to talk," I said. "But not here. These woods aren't safe." Mason nodded to his deputies, who began scanning the perimeter more intently. "We've got a tactical team assembling at the ranger station. Let's move." As we approached their vehicle, I noticed something that sent ice through my veins. The truck's rear tire had sunk slightly into the soft ground, revealing the undercarriage, which was caked with the same dark, silvery substance I'd collected from the broken window. These weren't humans. I raised my weapon as Mason turned, his expression shifting from confusion to something predatory. His face rippled, the skin around his jaw splitting to reveal glimpses of what lay beneath. "You should have left when the signs began, Sean Winters," he said, his voice degrading into something guttural. The forest offered warning. The deputies were changing too, their forms becoming fluid beneath their uniforms. I fired twice at the nearest one, striking center mass. The creature stumbled but didn't fall, dark ichor seeping through its uniform. I ran for the tree line, hoping to lose them in the thick undergrowth. Behind me, clothes ripped as the entities abandoned their human guises. Howls echoed through the forest, not just from my pursuers, but answered by others in the distance. They were converging. I crashed through the forest, navigating by instinct toward what I hoped was the eastern perimeter and the actual ranger station. The sound of pursuit was terrifying, not the crashing progress of humans, but the fluid, almost silent movement of predators evolved for woodland hunting. A fallen tree provided momentary cover. I pressed myself against the decomposing trunk, controlling my breathing as I scanned for movement. Nothing visible, but I could sense them, patient, circling, communicating in ways I couldn't perceive. Then I saw it. Not 50 yards away stood a figure that made my blood freeze. It was me, not the imperfect doppelganger from before, but a perfect copy down to the mud stains on my boots and the fresh scratch on my forearm from the broken window. Beside it stood Nathan, his ranger uniform torn to reveal patches of dark fur beneath. More figures emerged from the trees, some wearing ranger uniforms in various states of transformation, others fully shifted into something between wolf and human, walking upright on powerful hind legs. I counted 7 before giving up. They were assembling, forming a hunting party with my perfect double at its center. The doppelganger raised its head, inhaling deeply, then pointed directly at my position. They had my scent. I broke cover, abandoning stealth for speed. The forest became a blur as I pushed my exhausted body beyond its limits. Branches whipped my face. Roots threatened to trip me with every step, but stopping meant death. The eastern perimeter was marked by a service road. If I could reach it, I might flag down a vehicle or at least find clearer terrain for a final stand. My pursuers were gaining, their howls closer, filled with the certainty of predators who know their prey is failing. I burst through the final line of trees onto the gravel road, immediately blinded by headlights. A vehicle skidded to a stop mere feet away. The driver's door flew open, and Owen leaped out, a shotgun in his hands. "Get in!" he shouted, firing past me into the tree line. I hesitated for only a second. Was this another trap? But the genuine shock on Owen's face and the precise way he handled his weapon convinced me. This was the real Owen. I dove into the passenger seat as he fired once more before jumping behind the wheel. The engine roared as he accelerated, tires spitting gravel. In the side mirror, I watched my doppelganger step onto the road, surrounded by its pack. It raised a hand almost in farewell, as the distance between us grew. "What the hell were those things?" Owen demanded, knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I don't know," I answered truthfully, "but they've been here all along, watching us, learning from us." As we sped toward the ranger station, I described everything I'd seen and learned. Owen listened in silence, his expression growing more grim with each detail. "Nathan's been saying similar things," he finally said. "The medical staff think it's trauma-induced psychosis. They've got him sedated." "He's not crazy," I said, "and this isn't over." Owen glanced at me. "What do you mean?" I watched the darkening forest slip past the windows, feeling yellow eyes tracking our escape from hidden depths. "They let us go," I said quietly. "They could have taken that truck if they wanted to." This was a message. What message? I thought about the development plans, about territories violated and ancient guardians awakened, that the forest has its own rangers now. The days following my escape blurred together in a haze of debriefings, medical examinations, and disbelief from authorities. Sheriff Mason, the real one, listened to my account with professional courtesy but clear skepticism. The missing student's body was recovered from a ravine near Raccoon Hollow, his death attributed to exposure and injuries consistent with a fall. No mention was made of the evidence I'd found, or the journal entries describing a ranger doppelganger. Nathan remained hospitalized, heavily sedated whenever his delusions became too vivid. Only Owen believed me, having glimpsed the creatures himself during my rescue. We kept our theories private, recognizing that the truth would sound like madness to anyone who hadn't witnessed it firsthand. 3 weeks after the incident, I sat in my apartment, reviewing the evidence I'd secretly gathered. Photographs, samples of the silvery blood, historical records of similar occurrences stretching back decades. The pattern was undeniable once you knew what to look for. Disappearances and ranger doppelganger sightings always preceded major development projects in the forest. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I approached cautiously, weapon within reach, a habit I'd developed since returning to civilization. Through the peephole, I saw Gavin, Nathan's replacement as head ranger. I opened the door but blocked the entrance. "Gavin, didn't expect to see you off duty," he smiled tightly. "We need to talk, Sean. May I come in?" I studied him carefully, no signs of the unnatural movement that had betrayed the mimics before, but I'd learned to trust nothing. "What was the first thing you said to me when you joined the department 4 years ago?" I asked casually. His expression remained neutral. I asked if the coffee was always that bad or if someone was playing a joke on the new guy. I stepped aside, allowing him entry but maintaining distance. Gavin glanced at the evidence spread across my dining table, but made no comment as he took a seat on my sofa. "The county council is voting tomorrow on the resort development," he said without preamble. "I know. Your testimony about unusual activity in the forest has some of them concerned." He leaned forward. "They sent me to assess whether you're stable enough to return to duty." I laughed bitterly. "You mean they want to know if I'm going to cause problems at the vote?" "Something like that." Gavin studied me. "Nathan's being transferred to a specialized facility next week. Long-term care." The implication was clear. Continue pushing this story, and I'd face the same fate. "What do you want from me, Gavin?" "The truth." His expression softened slightly. "Off the record, man to man. What really happened out there?" I considered my options. Gavin had always been reasonable, pragmatic. He'd also spent years in these forests before transferring to our department. If anyone might be receptive to the truth, I told him everything. The doppelgangers, the transformations, the territorial message. As I spoke, his face remained impassive, offering no clue to his thoughts. When I finished, silence hung between us. Finally, he sighed. "I believe you." Before I could respond, he continued. "In my previous posting in Jefferson County, we had similar incidents. Rangers reporting seeing themselves in impossible locations. Hikers describing unusual encounters. Management buried it, attributed it to stress or wildlife misidentifications." Hope flared briefly. "Then you'll help me stop the development?" Gavin shook his head. "I'll help you understand what you're dealing with. These entities, they're not mindless beasts, Sean. They're guardians with an ancient claim to the land. Fighting them directly would be suicide." "So we just let them take people? Let them continue this infiltration?" "No. We establish boundaries, mutual respect." He reached into his jacket, removing a folder. "These are the original development plans. The resort would have claimed this entire section of old-growth forest. He opened the folder, revealing detailed maps. Yesterday, the developers suddenly submitted revised plans, cutting the footprint by 80% and preserving all the oldest sections of forest. No explanation given, just a complete reversal of their previous position. I stared at the maps, understanding dawning. They were approached. Gavin nodded. The CEO canceled a press appearance 2 days ago. When he resurfaced, he seemed changed. More environmentally conscious, he claimed. Spiritual awakening. Or he met something in the woods that showed him alternatives to his plans, I suggested. Exactly. Gavin collected the maps. The vote tomorrow will approve the revised development, limited human encroachment, most of the forest preserved, a compromise, and the disappearances, the mimicry, will likely stop once the territorial dispute is resolved. He met my gaze directly. Unless we provoke them again. After Gavin left, I sat alone with this new understanding. The creatures weren't mindless killers, they were guardians employing terror as a negotiation tactic. Effective, if brutal. The next morning, I attended the county council meeting. The revised development plans passed unanimously, celebrated as a win for both progress and conservation. I watched the CEO speak passionately about environmental stewardship, noting the unnatural stillness in his movements and the occasional yellow flash in his eyes when the lights hit them at certain angles. 1 week later, I returned to duty. The doppelganger sightings had ceased completely. Nathan was transferred to the facility upstate, his experience reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of solo night patrols. The missing student's case was closed, his death officially an accident. Life in Walworth County returned to normal, or what passed for normal when you knew what really lived among the ancient pines. On my first patrol of the eastern perimeter, I found a ranger hat placed carefully on a fallen log near the new boundary line established by the revised development plan. Beneath it lay a Polaroid photograph of me standing at my apartment window, a reminder that I was still being watched. I left the hat and photo untouched, but placed beside them my ranger badge, a gesture of recognition, a promise to respect their territory if they respected ours. As I turned to leave, I caught movement at the forest's edge, a familiar silhouette watching me. My doppelganger raised a hand in acknowledgement before melting back into the shadows of its domain. I understood the message clearly. The forest would always have its guardians. Some wore ranger uniforms with badges. Others wore ranger faces with yellow eyes. As I drove back toward the station, I passed the Welcome to Walworth County sign with its cheerful slogan, where nature and community thrive together. I couldn't help but smile at the unintentional truth of those words. Community indeed, human and otherwise, negotiating an uneasy peace in the shadow of the ancient pines. The limestone mountains of Pecos de Europa breathed with an ancient rhythm that morning, exhaling mist from their countless hidden mouths. These peaks contain some of the deepest cave systems found in Europe, where the greatest volume of water channeled underground through limestone passages carved over millions of years. Eloy Campillo Perez stood at the edge of Sotras, watching the fog roll between the jagged peaks, and felt something shift in the mountain's depths, a subtle tremor that spoke of hunger. At 31, Eloy had learned to read the mountain's moods. As forest ranger, he knew every trail, every hidden cave where the famous blue cheese aged in darkness. As mayor, he knew every secret his people carried. But lately, the mountain seemed different. The limestone caves that honeycombed the peaks had always whispered, water dripping through endless passages, air moving through chambers no man had ever seen. Now those whispers carried a different tone. The Spanish Civil War had ended 6 years ago, but its ghost still wandered these heights. General Franco's fascist victory had driven Republican fighters into the wild places, and the Picos de Europa had swallowed them whole. Some said 30,000 men had vanished into Spain's mountains. Eloy wondered how many had found their way into the deep places, into caves that descended over 1,000 meters into the earth's bowels. Walking the familiar path to his ranger station, Eloy passed the entrance to one of the cheese caves. The opening was modest, just large enough for a man to squeeze through with a wheel of cabrales strapped to his back. But Eloy knew these caves connected to vast networks that stretched for kilometers underground. Local cheesemakers had to hike for hours to reach some of the deeper caves, carrying their precious cargo on foot or horseback to wooden shelves deep inside where the cheese would age for months in complete darkness. The war had changed everything about these mountains. Where once shepherds had moved freely between the peaks with their flocks, now every shadow might conceal a guerrilla fighter or a civil guard patrol. The ancient caves that had sheltered shepherds during storms now harbored men with guns and grievances that ran deeper than the limestone passages themselves. Eloy's morning routine felt different today. The birds seemed quieter, even the ever-present sound of water moving through stone. The mountain's circulatory system, carried an undertone that made his skin crawl. When he reached his station, a note waited for him. The handwriting belonged to Alfonso Martinez, his fellow ranger and friend since childhood. Need to talk. Important information about the resistance. Meet me at the old oak grove after dark. Eloy's hands trembled as he read. Alfonso had always been cautious to the point of paranoia since the war ended. If he was requesting a meeting about the guerrillas, something significant had happened. That evening, fog thick as wool blanketed the mountainside. Eloy made his way to the oak grove, ancient trees that had stood when the Romans first glimpsed these peaks. The limestone beneath his feet was treacherous in the mist, sharp runnels and grikes carved by acidic rain, creating the perfect niches for mountain plants but dangerous footing for men. Alfonso emerged from the fog like a specter, his face pale and drawn. Eloy, thank God you came. I've been wrestling with this for days. What's happened? The civil guard approached me last week. They know about the resistance activities in our sector. They know Juan Fernandez Ayala is operating from the high caves. Eloy felt his blood chill. Juan had been his closest friend before the war. Brilliant, passionate, convinced that Spanish fascism could be defeated if the resistance remained strong enough long enough. If Franco's forces had located Juan's hideout, they want information, Alfonso continued. Specific locations, meeting times. They've promised protection for our families if we cooperate, and if we don't. Alfonso's silence answered that question. The fog seemed to press closer, and somewhere in the distance Eloy heard a sound that made his bones ache, a low moaning that might have been wind through cave openings, but carried notes of something far more unsettling. In these mountains the caves were known for their sounds, air moving through passages creating mournful wailing that had inspired local legends about supernatural creatures dwelling in the depths. I haven't given them anything yet, Alfonso whispered. But they're coming back tomorrow. They want locations of the guerrilla camps, and they specifically mentioned Juan. You know I can't ask you to risk your family, and I can't ask you to risk yours. But Eloy, there's something else. Something the guard captain said. He claimed they already have sources inside the resistance. Someone close to Juan has been feeding them information. The moaning sound from the caves grew louder, joined by others, a chorus of wind through limestone passages that sounded almost like voices calling from the deep places. Eloy had heard similar sounds his entire life, but tonight they seemed to carry words. Come down, come deep, feed the darkness. He shook his head, trying to clear it. We need to warn Juan. How? You know he won't trust any message that comes through normal channels now. And if there really is an informant, another sound joined the cave song. A rhythmic knocking, like hammers against stone, echoing from multiple directions. Local legends spoke of creatures called Tommyknockers that lived in caves and mines, whose knocking either warned of danger or caused cave-ins, depending on whether they were benevolent spirits or malevolent ones. I'll have to meet with him directly, Eloy decided. Face to face. He'll listen to me. That's suicide. If you're seen with him, if you're caught, then I'll be careful. But as they parted ways that night, both men felt eyes watching from the darkness. The limestone caves around Sotras had witnessed countless secrets over the millennia. Now they were about to witness another tragedy, one that would echo through their passages for 73 years. In the deepest cave beneath the mountain, a shaft called Torca de Topanoria that plunged nearly 200 meters straight down. Something stirred in response to the approaching betrayal. The limestone walls, carved by millions of years of patient water, began to weep in anticipation. April 15, 1945. The abandoned villa sat like a wound in the forest, its stone walls crumbling back into the earth from which they'd been quarried. Wild roses had conquered the courtyard, their thorns thick as barbed wire. Eloy approached through morning mist that clung to the peaks like funeral shrouds, each step on the limestone path echoing with ominous resonance. Juan Fernandez Ayala waited inside, flanked by 4 of his most trusted fighters. At 27, Juan had aged decades in the 6 years since the war's official end. His eyes held the hollow gleam of a man who'd seen too much death, lived too long in darkness. The guerrilla leader embraced his old friend, but Eloy felt tension in the gesture, the careful weariness of someone who'd learned that betrayal could come from anywhere. You took a risk coming here, Juan said. We both did. But this couldn't wait. The villa's walls seemed to lean inward as Eloy explained Alfonso's revelation. Ancient mortar crumbled at their voices, dust motes dancing in shafts of sunlight that pierced the rotting roof. Outside, the sound of dripping water from the caves seemed to grow more insistent, as if the mountain itself was listening. Juan's men, Stephen, a former school teacher, Gary, who'd lost his entire family to Franco's purges, Dennis, barely 18 but already a veteran of a dozen ambushes, listened with faces carved from stone. They'd survived by trusting no one completely. And now even that fragile trust was dissolving. Alfonso could be lying, Stephen suggested, testing your loyalty. Or the guards could be feeding him false information, Gary added, making him think there's an informant when there isn't. But Juan shook his head. There have been signs, patrols appearing where they shouldn't know to look, supply drops intercepted. Someone has been talking. The dripping sound from outside intensified, joined by what sounded like whispered conversations. The mountain's underground rivers carrying sounds through passages that connected cave to cave across kilometers of limestone. These cave systems formed a vast underground network where water dissolved calcium carbonate and entered the subsoil through sinkholes, creating rivers that found deeper spaces, abandoning their former courses to carve galleries and wells sometimes hundreds of meters deep. There's something else, Eloy said reluctantly. The guards specifically mentioned you by name, Juan. They know about your operations here. Dennis moved to the window, hand on his pistol. Could be anyone. Shepherds see our camps. Travelers spot our supply routes. No. Juan's voice carried absolute certainty. It's someone inside. Someone who knows our plans before we execute them. Through the villa's broken windows, the morning mist began to clear, revealing the limestone landscape beyond. A terrain so riddled with caves and fissures that entire armies could vanish without trace. Sharp potholes called jose dotted the surface, making the area notorious for the dangers faced by walkers and mountaineers. Local legends claimed these holes were mouths of sleeping giants, ready to swallow the unwary. That's when they heard the footsteps. The sound came from multiple directions, boots on stone, the careful tread of men moving through treacherous terrain. Juan's fighters had chosen this villa specifically because it could be easily defended, with clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. But now those advantages seemed meaningless. How many? Gary whispered, checking his rifle. Dennis peered through a crack in the wall. At least a dozen, maybe more in the tree line. The civil guard had come in force, but they'd made one crucial error. They'd announced their presence too early, allowing the guerrillas time to prepare. Juan smiled grimly. They want us alive. Otherwise they would have just opened fire. What do? We remind them why the Picos de Europa swallowed 30,000 of Franco's best men. The battle that followed would be remembered in local folklore for generations, though the official records would omit crucial details. The guerrillas knew every limestone ledge, every hidden approach, every cave entrance that could serve as escape route or ambush point. They turned the broken villa into a fortress, using the rubble and thorn-covered walls to create perfect firing positions. When the first civil guard assault came, 2 fascist soldiers fell immediately to perfectly placed shots from Stephen and Dennis. The others took cover behind the stone walls of the courtyard. But the guerrillas had anticipated this. Juan had cached weapons and ammunition in multiple positions during previous months, turning the entire area into a killing field. The battle raged for 3 hours, gunfire echoing off limestone cliffs and disappearing into cave mouths that seemed to swallow sound itself. The fascists had superior numbers, but the guerrillas had intimate knowledge of terrain that had been carved by millions of years of patient water, creating a landscape of sharp edges and hidden depths. But as the morning wore on, the sounds of battle began to change. The echoes from the gunfire started returning differently, as if the cave systems beneath them were amplifying and distorting each shot. Some of the soldiers reported hearing their own voices calling back to them from the depths, urging them deeper into the mountain. When the civil guard finally retreated to regroup, they left behind more than just their dead. They left behind men who seemed to have simply vanished, not killed, not wounded, just gone. Searchers would find their equipment scattered near cave entrances, but the men themselves had been swallowed by limestone passages that descended into absolute darkness. Juan and his fighters used the lull to gather what they could from the bodies of the fallen fascists. Among the dead was a civil guard captain whose uniform jacket contained a folded paper, their operational orders, complete with intelligence about guerrilla activities and the name of their informant, Alfonso Martinez. "I'm sorry, old friend," Juan said when Eloy read the name. "But you know what this means." Eloy nodded, understanding that their childhood friendship was about to end in blood. The mountain's whispered voices seemed to grow louder, as if sensing approaching death. That evening, as the survivors made their way back to their hidden camps, through passages that had been carved by ancient glaciers and patient water, they heard new sounds from the deepest caves. Not the familiar drip of condensation or the whistle of air through passages, but something that sounded almost like weeping. The Torca de Topanoria had been carved over millions of years by water seeking the path of least resistance through limestone, creating a shaft that plunged nearly 200 meters straight into the mountain's heart. Local shepherds avoided the area, claiming the cave entrance breathed with malevolent intent. Tonight, it seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the sacrifice it knew was coming. April 24th, 1945. The summons came at dawn. A single knock on Eloy's door, followed by Juan's voice calling softly through the wood. When Eloy emerged, he found his childhood friend flanked by Stephen and Gary, their faces grim as granite. The morning mist clung to the peaks like shrouds, and somewhere in the distance, the caves were singing. "We need to talk," Juan said simply. They walked in silence through paths Eloy had known since childhood, limestone tracks carved by shepherds and their flocks over centuries, the familiar landmarks, the twisted oak struck by lightning, the spring where crystal-clear water emerged from the mountain's depths, seemed different now, touched by an atmosphere of impending doom. The water that flowed from these springs had traveled through vast underground networks, dissolving calcium carbonate and carving galleries that could extend for kilometers beneath the surface. Local folklore claimed these waters carried messages between the deep places, that the mountain itself could speak through the liquid voices of its hidden rivers. Today, those voices seemed to whisper of death. The guerrilla camp lay hidden in a valley accessible only through a narrow defile between towering limestone cliffs. Here, among caves that had sheltered Spanish shepherds for millennia, Juan's fighters had built their stronghold. Rough shelters clung to cave entrances, and supply caches were hidden in passages that extended deep into the mountain's core. But as they approached the camp, Eloy noticed something wrong. The usual sounds, men cleaning weapons, preparing food, the low murmur of conversation, were absent. The only sound came from the caves themselves, a rhythmic knocking that echoed from multiple directions, as if the mountain were trying to communicate in some primitive Morse code. Local legends spoke of Tommy knockers, supernatural creatures whose knocking either warned of danger or caused cave-ins. Today, the knocking seemed to carry both meanings, warning and threat intertwined. "Alfonso has been feeding information to the civil guard for months," Juan said without preamble. "The attack on the villa, our lost supply drops, the patrols that knew exactly where to find us, all of it traces back to him." Eloy felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You're certain?" Stephen produced the captured documents from the civil guard captain. Page after page of intelligence reports, meeting locations, names of resistance fighters, all in Alfonso's careful handwriting. "He's been documenting everything," Gary said bitterly. "Our strength, our weapons, our plans. Franco's dogs know more about our operations than some of our own men." The knocking from the caves intensified, joined by a low moaning that seemed to emerge from the deepest passages. The moaning cavern's titular sound had served as a siren song for nearly 100 prehistoric people whose remains were found at the bottom, having been tempted to their death by the mysterious sounds. "What do you want from me?" Eloy asked, though he already knew. "Justice," Juan replied. "The kind of justice these mountains understand." They walked deeper into the valley, past cave entrances that exhaled cold air carrying scents of limestone and ancient darkness. Some of these caves descended over 1,000 meters into the Earth's core, creating vertical worlds where sunlight had never penetrated, and water carved impossible architectures of stone. At the valley's heart sat the entrance to Torca de Toponoria, a limestone shaft that plunged nearly 200 meters straight down into absolute darkness. Local shepherds had always avoided the area, claiming the cave breathed with malevolent purpose. Children were warned never to approach the entrance, where loose stones might give way beneath unwary feet. "Alfonso betrayed not just us, but every man who died fighting fascism," Juan continued. "Every family destroyed by Franco's purges, every dream of a free Spain." The cave entrance seemed to exhale as they approached, releasing air that had circulated through passages carved over millions of years. The breath carried whispers, not quite words, but sounds that suggested meaning, as if the mountain itself were participating in their conversation. "I understand your anger," Eloy said carefully. "But Alfonso is still my friend. There might be explanations." "Explanations?" Stephen's voice cracked with fury. "Men are dead because of his information. Our friends, our brothers, lit into ambushes because Alfonso sold them for fascist silver. The limestone beneath their feet was treacherous here, riddled with fissures and hidden holes that could swallow a man without warning. The acidic rain had carved sharp runnels and grikes into the rock surface, creating perfect niches for alpine plants but dangerous footing for humans." As they talked, more sounds emerged from the cave system, voices that might have been wind through passages, or might have been something else entirely. The echoes seemed to carry words. "Feed us, feed the darkness, give us what we hunger for." "The mountain is calling for justice," Juan said, and Eli wasn't sure if his friend was speaking metaphorically, or if he'd begun to believe the local superstitions about these caves having consciousness and intent. That afternoon they brought Alfonso to the valley. The ranger came willingly, believing he was meeting with Eloy to discuss their predicament. His face went pale when he saw Juan and the other guerrillas waiting, but he maintained his composure. "I can explain everything," Alfonso began, but Juan cut him off. "We found your reports. Your handwriting, your signature on documents that led to the deaths of our comrades. Alfonso's composure cracked. You don't understand the pressure. They threatened my children, my wife. They promised protection if I cooperated, death if I didn't. What choice did I have? The same choice we all had, Stephen replied coldly. The choice between courage and cowardice. The argument that followed would echo in the memories of everyone present. Alfonso pleaded, explaining his terror for his family's safety, his desperation to find some middle ground between competing loyalties. Juan and his men remained unmoved, their faces carved from the same limestone that surrounded them. As the sun set behind the peaks, painting the limestone cliffs blood red, the sounds from Torca de Topanoria grew louder. The moaning, the knocking, the whispered voices, all seemed to build toward some inevitable crescendo. The mountain has heard everything, Juan said finally. It knows about betrayal. It knows about justice, and it's hungry. What happened next would remain hidden in the depths of the cave for 73 years, but the limestone walls would remember every detail. They would preserve the sounds of that evening like some geological recording device, waiting for the right moment to play back the echoes of betrayal and revenge. The Torca de Topanoria opened its mouth wider, exhaling ancient air that carried the scent of deep places where water had carved cathedrals of stone in absolute darkness. Somewhere in those depths, something waited with patience older than human civilization, ready to add new voices to its eternal chorus. Summer 2018, Dr. Mercedes Campillo Perez, 75 and fierce as the mountain winds, stood at the entrance to Torca de Topanoria and felt her father's presence in the limestone air. The professional cavers hired by the Spanish government worked methodically around her, preparing their descent into nearly 200 meters of absolute darkness, but Mercedes barely noticed their activity. She was listening to older sounds, whispers that had echoed through these passages for over 7 decades. The search team had been exploring the deep cave systems of Picos de Europa for months, as part of the government's initiative to recover remains from Spain's turbulent past. These mountains contain some of the deepest cave systems in Europe, with over 30,700 caves forming a vast underground network carved by millions of years of water-dissolving limestone. Each cave was a potential tomb, a repository of secrets the mountain had swallowed and preserved. Dr. Fernando Rodriguez, the expedition leader, approached Mercedes with respectful caution. "Senora, we're ready to begin the descent. Are you certain you want to remain here during the excavation?" Mercedes looked into the cave entrance, where mist seemed to breathe outward from depths that had never known sunlight. "I've been waiting 73 years for this moment. I'm not leaving now." The cave's mouth was larger than expected, carved by ancient processes that had shaped the entire Pecos de Europa region. Glaciation and karstification over hundreds of millions of years had created this landscape, where water entered the subsoil through sinkholes and carved galleries and wells, sometimes hundreds of meters deep. The Torca de Topanoria was one of the deepest shafts in the region, its walls polished smooth by millennia of patient erosion. As the cavers prepared their equipment, Mercedes heard other sounds joining the familiar whisper of air through stone passages. Rhythmic knocking echoed from multiple directions, and she remembered childhood stories about supernatural creatures that lived in caves and mines. The Tommyknockers were said to knock either as warnings of danger or as harbingers of cave-ins, and their sounds often preceded discoveries of the dead. The descent began at dawn, 3 professional cavers disappearing into the shaft like offerings to some ancient deity. Their helmet lights created dancing shadows on the limestone walls, illuminating rock formations that had taken millions of years to form. Radio chatter from the descent team crackled with technical observations about the cave's structure, but Mercedes heard something else in the static, voices that might have been echoes, or might have been something more, deeper. "Find us. We've been waiting so long." The first set of remains appeared after 6 hours of careful excavation. Bones embedded in mud and debris at the bottom of the shaft, mixed with fragments of cloth that had somehow survived decades in the cave's particular microclimate. When the cavers radioed their discovery, Mercedes felt her heart clench with a mixture of relief and grief. But as the excavation continued, the team made increasingly disturbing discoveries. The bones showed clear evidence of deliberate placement rather than accidental fall, arranged in a manner that suggested someone had climbed down to position the body with almost ritualistic care. More unsettling were the sounds that began emerging from deeper passages. The cave system extended far beyond the main shaft, connecting to networks that stretched for kilometers underground. From these hidden depths came new voices, not the familiar whispers of air through stone, but something that sounded almost like conversation. Dr. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio, tension evident despite his professional tone. "Mercedes, we're finding evidence of multiple individuals. The remains are scattered throughout the chamber, but in patterns that suggest intentional arrangement." "How many?" Mercedes asked. A long pause. At least 2 distinct sets of remains, possibly more in the deeper passages. As afternoon faded into evening, the team extracted bone fragments that DNA analysis would later confirm belonged to Eloy Campilio Perez. But they also found something that would transform the discovery from simple historical recovery to active murder investigation. The remains of a young girl, aged approximately 10 to 14, who had died sometime between 5 and 15 years after Eloy's execution. The girl's bones told a troubling story. Despite supposedly falling nearly 200 meters into a rocky cave floor, only her skull showed significant damage. Her femur and jaw were completely intact, as if someone had lowered her body into the depths rather than allowing her to fall. This anomaly suggested either an impossible physical scenario or something far more sinister. Murder followed by a ritualistic burial in the mountain's depths. Dr. Fernando Cerullia, the renowned forensic anthropologist who had helped identify soldiers from the Falklands War, arrived the following week to examine the second set of remains. Her analysis only deepened the mystery. The girl's bone structure indicated a diet rich in low-fat animal proteins rather than the corn-based diet typical of rural families, suggesting she came from the more populous coastal regions rather than the mountain villages. This child was not a local shepherd, Dr. Cerulli announced. Her physical development, dental structure, and bone density all indicate she lived near the coast before coming to these mountains. But perhaps most disturbing were the DNA results that created a physical description of the unknown girl. 4'8" tall, with green eyes and dark brown hair. When this description was disseminated throughout Cantabria, no one came forward with information. It was as if the girl had existed only to disappear into the mountain's hunger. The evening after Dr. Cerullia's announcement, Mercedes camped at the cave entrance despite her family's protests. At 75, she was determined to maintain vigil over her father's final resting place and the unknown child who had shared his dark tomb. That night, alone with the limestone walls and the whispered conversations of underground rivers, Mercedes heard sounds that would haunt her remaining years. From the deepest passages came voices, not quite words, but sounds that carried meaning. They seemed to be calling to each other across the vast network of caves, sharing stories of those who had entered the darkness and never returned. Among those voices, she was certain she heard her father's, still trying to explain, still seeking forgiveness for choices made in impossible circumstances. And beneath it all, a child's voice, speaking in a dialect she couldn't quite place, telling stories of a hidden community that had lived and died in the mountain's embrace without the outside world ever knowing they existed. The knocking sounds intensified throughout the night, echoing from caves and shafts throughout the surrounding peaks. The Picos de Europa contained over 400 kilometers of mapped cave passages, with new discoveries being made regularly by speleologists from around the world. Each of these caves seemed to be participating in some vast underground conversation, as if the mountain itself were processing the revelation of its long-held secrets. By morning, Mercedes had made a decision that would scandalize her remaining family but somehow felt absolutely right. When the investigation concluded and her father's remains were returned for proper burial, she would ensure the unknown girl was buried beside him in Sotra's ancient cemetery. They've been together in the dark for so many years, she told the journalists who had gathered to report on the discovery. It wouldn't be right to separate them now, but that decision would prove to be only the beginning of the mountain's revelations. As investigators continued exploring the cave system, they began finding evidence of other disappearances. Fragments of clothing, personal items, bones that suggested Torca de Topanoria had been feeding on human tragedy for far longer than anyone imagined. The limestone had been patient, preserving its secrets in chambers carved by millions of years of flowing water. Now, finally, it was ready to tell its stories. But with each revelation came new questions about what had really happened in those depths, and whether some hungers could ever truly be satisfied. October 2018, the autumn mists clung to the Pecos de Europa like funeral veils, and in the depths of Torca de Topanoria, something ancient stirred with satisfaction. The mountain had kept its secrets for 73 years, but now the limestone walls were ready to reveal truths that would reshape understanding of what had happened in those depths. Dr. Fernando Cerullia stood at the cave entrance, reviewing forensic reports that defied conventional explanation. 3 months of investigation had uncovered not 2 sets of remains, but evidence of at least 7 individuals who had entered the cave system over several decades and never emerged. The pattern suggested something far more disturbing than isolated tragedies. The cave has been collecting, she announced to the assembled investigators, her voice carrying undertones of unease. Each of these deaths shows similar characteristics, evidence of careful placement rather than accidental fall, positioning that suggests ritualistic behavior, and timing that coincides with periods of social upheaval in the region. The Spanish Civil Guard detective assigned to the case, Inspector Carlos Mendez, reviewed the timeline they had constructed. Eloy Campillo Perez in 1945. The unknown girl sometime between 1950 and 1960. An adult male in the 1970s, whose dental work suggested he was from Northern Europe. 2 more individuals in the 1980s, during the height of political tensions in the Basque regions, and most recently, remains that dated to the early 1990s. 7 people over nearly 50 years, Inspector Mendez said. All found in the same cave system, all showing evidence of deliberate placement. This isn't coincidence, but it was the discovery in the deepest chambers that had truly shaken the investigation team. Beyond the main shaft, where passages narrowed to barely human-sized crawlways, the cavers had found a chamber that defied geological explanation. The walls were covered in symbols, not carved, but somehow formed by mineral deposits over decades, as if the limestone itself had been writing messages. The symbols told a story that connected all the victims across the decades. Images of betrayal, of communities hiding from authorities, of children separated from families during times of war and persecution. And beneath it all, recurring motifs of a presence that demanded payment, sacrifice, appeasement for some ancient wrong. Dr. Rodriguez, the expedition leader, had spent weeks mapping the chamber before admitting defeat. The symbols appear to have formed naturally through mineral deposition, but the patterns are too complex, too narrative to be purely geological. It's as if the cave itself has been remembering. The breakthrough came when investigators realized the chamber's symbols weren't random ancient markings, but a record of the hidden community that had lived in these mountains during and after the Spanish Civil War. Following Franco's rise to power, many innocent Spaniards had simply disappeared, not all victims of fascist persecution, and not all joining guerrilla movements, but some choosing to live off the grid in Spain's remote, mine-riddled mountains. These invisible people had built ramshackle housing hidden among pine-blanketed hillsides, working as undocumented miners and creating their own society in the spaces between official recognition. They married, had children, lived entire lives in the shadows, but remained utterly secluded from the world around them. When someone from their community went missing, they would never involve outside authorities. A police investigation might uncover far more than just the truth about a disappearance. It could expose the entire hidden community to persecution they had spent decades avoiding. The unknown girl from the cave suddenly made sense in this context. She hadn't been a rural shepherd's child who accidentally fell to her death. She had been part of the invisible community, and when she vanished, her people had searched for her themselves, following tracks that led to the same limestone shaft where Eloy Campillo Perez had met his end decades earlier. But the girl's death had not been an accident either. The forensic evidence suggested she had been killed elsewhere and then lowered into the cave with ritualistic care, positioned beside Eloy's remains as if someone were creating a grotesque collection. The horrifying truth emerged slowly through careful analysis of soil samples, mineral deposits, and the testimony of elderly locals who finally felt safe enough to speak about the hidden community they had helped support over the decades. The unknown girl had not been the first child to disappear. Over the years, several young people from the invisible community had vanished, always during times of particular stress or exposure risk. Someone had been using the cave as both dumping ground and shrine, feeding victims to whatever presence dwelt in those depths. The limestone walls had absorbed more than just mineral deposits. They had soaked up decades of terror, grief, and desperate attempts to appease something that demanded regular sacrifice. Inspector Mendez's final report would remain classified for decades, but those who read it learned that the investigation had uncovered evidence of a serial killer who had operated across multiple decades, targeting the most vulnerable members of society, the people who had no official existence, whose disappearances would never be reported to authorities. The killer had intimate knowledge of both the hidden community and the cave systems, understanding exactly how to make victims disappear without trace. More disturbing, the evidence suggested the murders had been committed by someone within the community itself, someone who had convinced the others that periodic sacrifice was necessary to prevent discovery by hostile authorities. The symbols in the deepest chamber told the story of this deception. Images of a trusted figure, always present but face obscured, leading victims into the darkness. Pictures of the community prospering after each disappearance as if the death somehow protected them from exposure. But the limestone had preserved more than just mineral records. In the deepest passages, where air circulation was minimal and preservation conditions optimal, investigators found fragments of clothing, personal items, and other evidence that painted a picture of systematic predation spanning decades. The final horror came when they realized the killer was still alive. DNA evidence from the most recent remains pointed to someone who had continued operating into the 1990s, possibly beyond. The methodical nature of the crime suggested someone with extensive knowledge of forensics, investigation procedures, and how to avoid detection. Inspector Mendez issued quiet alerts to law enforcement agencies throughout northern Spain, warning them to watch for similar patterns of disappearance among marginalized populations. But he knew the chances of identifying the killer after so many decades were minimal. The mountain had kept its secrets well, and some of those secrets would remain hidden in limestone passages that descended deeper than any investigation could reach. On the final day of active investigation, Mercedes Campillo Perez made one last visit to her father's gravesite. At 75, she had witnessed her father's vindication, seen his name cleared of collaboration with fascist forces, and learned the truth about his execution by former friends who had been driven to extremes by war and betrayal. But she had also learned that Eloy's death had been only the beginning of something far darker. The cave that had swallowed him had developed a taste for human tragedy, and someone had spent decades feeding that hunger with victims who would never be missed. Standing at the entrance to Torca de Topenorio one final time, Mercedes heard the familiar sounds: dripping water, air moving through passages, the geological conversations of limestone formations, settling and shifting with imperceptible patience. But underneath those natural sounds, she still heard voices. Her father's voice, no longer seeking forgiveness but offering warnings. The unknown girl's voice, calling to other children who might be tempted to explore caves without understanding their dangers. And other voices, dozens of them, representing all the people who had entered these depths over the centuries and never returned. The limestone would continue its patient work, dissolving and reforming, creating new passages and sealing old ones, gradually erasing the physical evidence of what had happened in its depths. But the mountain's memory was longer than human lifespans, and some stories would echo through those passages long after the last human voice fell silent. As Mercedes walked away from the cave for the final time, she heard one last sound from the depths, a rhythmic knocking that might have been falling stones, or might have been the mountain's equivalent of applause, acknowledging an audience for stories it had waited so long to tell. The Picos de Europa breathed with their ancient rhythm, exhaling mist from countless hidden mouths, ready to swallow new secrets and preserve them in limestone archives that would outlast civilizations. The mountain was patient, the mountain was hungry, and the mountain was always listening for the approach of new voices to add to its eternal chorus. In the deepest passages of Torca de Topenoria, something settled back into dormancy, satisfied for now with the chaos and revelation it had orchestrated. The limestone walls resumed their slow work of preservation and dissolution, waiting with geological patience for the next chapter in their endless story of human tragedy and mountain memory. The investigation was closed, but the hunger remained, patient as stone, deep as the passages that honeycombed the peaks, eternal as the limestone that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires and would witness countless more before the mountains themselves finally crumbled into the sea.